What if the oldest written history on Earth is not our beginning, but the 7th time civilization has tried to return? What if the first pages we ever wrote are already an afterword, composed by survivors? In a quiet gallery in Oxford, a small clay prism sits under glass, unassuming, cracked, and impossibly confident. Its surface carries a list of kings, cities, and reigns recorded with the calm precision of accounting. Yet the numbers it announces do not behave like history, and they do not read like metaphor either. They read like a memory that refuses to fit inside our modern scale. This is the Weld Blundell Prism, a Sumerian king list copied nearly 4,000 years ago from older traditions, an artifact that dares us to take it seriously. It begins with a claim as simple as it is unsettling. Kingship descended from heaven, and the first rulers governed for tens of thousands of years. Names appear like echoes from a shoreline we can no longer reach: Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shurupak, anchoring wonder to real ground, real rivers, and real mud brick cities. Then the text delivers a single hinge, written in the same steady tone as everything before. The flood swept over, and kingship was lowered again. So what are we looking at? An encrypted chronicle of lost ages, or a political instrument designed to make authority feel eternal? Are the 6 civilizations before ours literal chapters erased by water and ice? Or are they mythic compressions of many collapses, folded into a single story humans can carry through disaster? Before we begin, let us know in the comments below where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in for a journey to answer the question, we are this 7th civilization. In Oxford, inside the Ashmolean Museum, a small clay prism sits with quiet certainty. It is not large, not jewelled, and not theatrical, yet it draws the eye like a sealed message. Under museum lights, its baked surface holds a soft, earthen sheen, warm brown, faintly mottled and scarred by time. Its faces are packed with wedge marks that look orderly, even soothing, especially when raking light makes each impression cast a tiny shadow. Up close, the lines are dense and disciplined, with columns that keep their spacing as if the clay itself demanded neatness. The calm breaks when the list announces its first boundary, and the words step beyond ordinary history. It begins with kings who ruled before the flood. This object is called the Weld Blundell Prism, catalogued as Ashmolean Museum, AN 1923. 4. It is not a modern curiosity or a romantic prop, and it was not made to impress a future audience. It is a real artifact, written in real cuneiform, copied in the early 2nd millennium BCE, and preserved because clay, when fired or accidentally baked, can outlast empires. It carries a version of the Sumerian king list, a text that tries to explain who ruled, where power belonged, and why. In Mesopotamia, authority was not merely personal, and it was not merely military. Kingship was a cosmic arrangement, and the list reads like an attempt to map that arrangement onto time. The prism's shape matters because it was made to be turned and read, almost like a rotating archive. Each side continues the same story, as if the record is too large for one surface and too important to be abbreviated. The format also signals intention. This is a curated text, designed for handling, teaching, and recitation. The scribe pressed a cut-reed stylus into damp clay, then the clay hardened and survived. Every wedge is a physical act, a tiny collision of tool and earth that becomes language through convention. The marks are not pictures and they are not random scratches. They are signs that encode sounds, words and numbers with bureaucratic precision. Cuneiform itself is a long experiment in compressing reality into symbols. It begins as accounting, then expands into law, literature, and ritual, because a state that can count can also command. It can record poetry, and it can record grain totals, sometimes on the same shelf, because both are ways of stabilizing a world that changes. The king list is not a diary of daily events, and it does not linger on personalities or scandals. It is a political and religious argument written as a sequence of reigns, arranged to look inevitable. It claims that kingship is a divine institution that descends from heaven, then moves from city to city. It ties legitimacy to a chain that looks unbroken, even when the ground beneath it shifts. The unsettling part is not that ancient people told grand stories, because every civilization does that. The unsettling part is that the list reads like administration, with the tone of a ledger rather than a legend. It names cities, it names rulers, it counts reign lengths, and it organises time. It does this while insisting that the earliest reigns lasted tens of thousands of years. The Prism begins with Eridu, then Bad Tabira, then Larak Sipa and Shurapak. These are not fantasy realms, and they are not vague once upon a time settings. They are places that exist in the geography of southern Mesopotamia, near the shifting courses of the Tigris and Euphrates. The list says kingship was in Eridu first, then it was carried onward, as if power itself is a portable object. That claim fits a landscape where rivers wander, marshes expand, and cities rise on engineered ground. In the alluvial plain, water is both lifeline and threat, and political centres can migrate as channels silt up. When the list says kingship moved, it echoes a real pattern of Mesopotamian history. Urban dominance shifting with ecology, trade routes, and force. Then the numbers arrive with a force that feels almost mathematical, and the text does not soften their impact. Alulim rules 28,800 years, and Alalgar rules 36,000 years, as if longevity were an administrative fact. Enmenluana rules 43,200 years, and the pattern continues with reigns that dwarf recorded human history. They are presented without apology and without explanation. The text does not pause to justify the scale, and it does not add a footnote in the voice of a priest. It does not say these were gods or metaphors or dreams, even though later readers often reach for those categories. It simply counts, and the counting is the point. It is a list that expects to be believed, or at least respected, because lists are how states remember. That is part of what makes the Prism feel so modern, despite its age. Bureaucracy has a recognisable texture, and its confidence is contagious. When a document offers totals, sequences, and tidy transitions, the mind wants to treat it as data. The king list exploits that instinct, and it does so with unnerving calm. After a sequence of these Antediluvian kings, the king list hits a single line that changes everything. The flood sweeps through, and the phrasing is almost abrupt, like a stamp on a file. Kingship is lowered again, and the world restarts with new dynasties and new cities. The catastrophe is not described in detail, yet it functions as a hard boundary in time. On the far side of that break, the reigns shrink and the rhythm of the text changes with them. They are still long by modern standards, but they become imaginable, and they begin to feel human. Hundreds of years become decades, and decades become the kind of spans that fit a lifetime with heirs and rivals. The list begins to overlap with archaeology and later historical tradition, even when the matches are imperfect. That sudden contraction creates the documentary's central tension, because it looks like a before and after photograph. The same text that offers recognisable city names also offers impossible durations, and it refuses to label one section as fiction. The same artifact that anchors early Mesopotamian identity also points to a time that looks nothing like ours. If the list is only myth, why does it keep the structure of a government record? What if the oldest written history on Earth is not describing the first civilization, but a world already old? What if it is describing a recovery after repeated collapses, remembered as a descent in scale? What if, in Sumer's own framing, we are living after multiple resets? To do that, we need to understand what cuneiform is and what it is not, because the medium shapes the message. Cuneiform is not a single alphabet, and it is not a simple code. It is a flexible script that can represent syllables, logograms, and determinatives depending on context and period. In plain terms, it is a tool that can be both precise and ambiguous, which matters when we read ancient claims. A prism like this is not casual writing, and it is not the work of an amateur. It is a deliberate copy made by trained scribes in a scribal school culture, where students learned by reproducing authoritative texts. The early 2nd millennium BCE was a time when Mesopotamian cities looked back to Sumer as an authoritative past. Copying older lists was a way to inherit legitimacy and to organise identity, especially after political upheavals reshaped the region. That context explains why historians take the Prism seriously as an artifact, even when they question its content. The clay, the script style, and the language fit what we know of its era, and its wear patterns match an object that has been handled. Its text matches other king list manuscripts, even when versions disagree in details. It is part of a family of sources, not a lone anomaly. Taking it seriously does not mean taking every claim literally, and that distinction is the first discipline of historical thinking. Historians separate two questions that must not be confused, even when they feel emotionally linked. Is the object authentic? Are the statements inside it factual in the modern sense? The Prism passes the first test because it is genuinely ancient and consistent with known scribal practice. The second test is where debate begins, because ancient texts often mix ideology, myth, and memory in a single breath. A king list can be a political instrument and still preserve older material, because propaganda often borrows from tradition to sound credible. The king list had a job to do in its own world, and that job was not neutral. It linked rival cities into a single story of rightful rule, creating a map of legitimacy across centuries. It smoothed over breaks, civil wars, and competing claims by presenting one line of kingship as if conflict were merely a change of address. It also framed political authority as sacred, because sacred authority is harder to challenge and easier to inherit. That purpose can shape the numbers, and the numbers can shape belief in return. Long reigns can magnify prestige, and prestige can stabilize power, especially in a culture where the past is a source of legal and ritual authority. A king who rules for thousands of years is not just old, he is cosmic, and his city becomes the first center of order. Still, the list structure remains stubborn, and it resists being filed neatly as poetry. It is not written as a hymn, and it is not written as a mythic epic with dialogue and drama. It is written as a sequence of reigns, with totals that can be added and compared. It invites calculation, which makes its exaggerations feel like data. So we have to talk about ancient numbers, because numbers are never only numbers. The Sumerians used a sexagesimal system based on 60, and that system is why we still count minutes and seconds the way we do. In practice, sexagesimal notation is efficient for fractions because 60 has many divisors. In plain terms, it is good for measuring land, grain, and time without messy remainders. Sexagesimal counting also makes certain large numbers easy to express and to pattern, and pattern can become meaning. It supports numerological design, where numbers carry significance beyond measurement, and where symmetry signals order. In Mesopotamia, numbers could be symbolic, ritual, and administrative at the same time, an accountant's tool and a theologian's language. The king list's Antediluvian reigns often cluster around multiples that look intentional rather than observed. Scholars have noted patterns that suggest formula, not eyewitness memory, and the repetition is hard to ignore. Some propose that the reign lengths are constructed from sacred units, then scaled upward to signal an age of greatness. If so, the list is not lying in a simple sense. It is encoding hierarchy through arithmetic. Another proposal is that the word we translate as years may not map cleanly to modern solar years, even when the translation is conventional. Ancient calendars used lunar months, intercalations, and local conventions that shifted over time, and administrative years could be tied to regnal counting or festival cycles. Some researchers ask whether the units could be months, seasons, or ceremonial cycles. The question is technical, but it matters because it changes what the text claims. If a year in the list were a month, the numbers would shrink dramatically, and the kings would step closer to biological possibility. If it were a season, they would shrink differently, and the totals would still be extraordinary. But even generous conversions often leave reigns far longer than plausible human lifespans, especially when multiple rulers stack one after another. The unit question matters, but it does not dissolve the mystery. A third proposal is prestige exaggeration, the oldest trick in political memory, and it does not require a complex calendar. A dynasty that wants to look ancient stretches time backward, because age implies inevitability. It places its origins in a golden age, then claims continuity through catastrophe, because continuity is power. The flood becomes a narrative hinge that explains why the present is smaller, why greatness lies behind, not ahead. Yet the list does not only inflate, and that restraint is part of its credibility. It also preserves names that appear elsewhere, sometimes in different genres that were not designed to agree. Later kings like Gilgamesh show up in literature and in kingly traditions tied to real cities, and their stories carry local pride. Dynasties after the flood begin to align with archaeological horizons, even if the details remain contested and the reign lengths remain stylized. That mixed signal is why the Prism matters, and why it has held attention for more than a century. It is not easy to dismiss as pure fantasy, and it is not safe to accept as literal chronicle. It sits in the uncomfortable middle where myth and record overlap, and where memory can carry fragments of real events. The question becomes not whether it is true, but what kind of truth it is trying to deliver. Here is the rule for this investigation. We will not treat an ancient text as either sacred truth or worthless fiction, because both reactions stop the analysis too soon. We will treat it as evidence of what people believed, what they wanted to claim, and what they might have remembered. Then we will test each claim with tools the text itself did not have. Comparative mythology will tell us whether the flood is uniquely Sumerian or widely shared, and whether shared motifs cluster around certain details. Archaeology will tell us what cities existed, when they rose, and when they fell, because burned layers and abandoned streets are their own kind of sentence. Earth science will tell us what kinds of floods, climate shifts and impacts could leave deep cultural scars, because sediments remember what people cannot. We will also track how stories travel, because memory has roots like trade. A motif that appears across continents can be coincidence, diffusion, or a response to common human experience, and we have to discriminate carefully. The goal is not to force every tradition into one timeline, and it is not to flatten cultures into a single myth. The goal is to see whether multiple traditions point toward a real pattern of catastrophe and rebuilding. The central question stays simple, even when the evidence is not, and that simplicity is deliberate. Do Sumerian king lists and parallel global traditions preserve memory of multiple advanced civilizations before ours? Or are they mythic frameworks that encode how humans process catastrophe, time, and loss? If the answer is symbolic, we still have to ask why the symbol takes the shape of a ledger. The Prism in Oxford does not answer that question by itself, and it does not need to. It only proves that the question is ancient, and that it was asked in the language of administration. Someone, 4,000 years ago, thought history began before a flood, with rulers who belonged to a different scale of time. That is not a modern internet rumour, it is a claim pressed into clay. If that claim is symbolic, we need to know what it symbolises and why the symbol is so consistent across copies. If it is distorted memory, we need to know what event could distort memory that way, stretching time into the tens of thousands. If it is propaganda, we need to know what political need required a past so vast, and why that vastness was placed before a single dividing line. The Sumerian king list begins before the flood, and it begins with a claim. Kingship descended from heaven, then it settled into a city, an origin statement delivered with the cool certainty of bookkeeping. That sentence is not decoration, and it is not an optional prologue. It is the foundation that makes rule feel inevitable, natural, and protected, because it places authority outside ordinary human bargaining. Visually, imagine the tablet surface under raking light. Wedge-shaped impressions march in straight lines, and the clay itself seems to insist that this is record, not rumour. In the list, kingship first belongs to Eridu, a real place in southern Mesopotamia. The name anchors the story to geography, even when time becomes enormous and the human scale begins to dissolve. Eridu is followed by Bad Tibira, then Larak, then Sippar, then Shuruppak. The sequence reads like a route across the alluvial plain, not a dreamscape, as if kingship travels along canals and riverbanks. These cities matter because they were remembered as centres of order. A list that names places can be checked, argued over, and inherited, which is exactly what political memory needs. Southern Mesopotamia is flat, silty, and restless. The Tigris and Euphrates shift their channels over centuries, laying down new land while erasing old shorelines, an environment that rewards careful administration. In such a landscape, cities are not only settlements, they are engineering projects, built on raised mounds and sustained by canals, levees, and labour schedules that must be coordinated year after year. The text does not explain how kingship travels, and it does not need to. In Mesopotamian political thought, authority is a transferable office, not a personal trait locked to one bloodline. When kingship moves, the world remains coherent because the institution survives. The city changes, but the cosmic contract stays intact, and the list keeps that contract legible. This is the architecture of memory the list is building. It is a single chain that links rival city-states into one story of rightful succession, even when those cities competed in real time. A chain like that is useful in a region where power was often fragmented, City-states rose and fell, traded alliances, and fought over water rights. Yet the list offers a higher continuity above the disputes. The Antediluvian kings arrive with a calm tone of administration. Alulim rules 20,800 years, and the list treats that number as ordinary, as if it were a standard entry in an account. Alalgar follows with 36,000 years, and the pattern continues without apology. The writing does not signal metaphor, and it does not signal disbelief, which is part of its persuasive force. The effect is deliberate because a ledger voice creates authority. A reader is invited to accept the scale because the format looks procedural, and procedure feels like truth. We should not rush to decide whether these reigns are literal or symbolic. We should first ask what such numbers do inside a political document, especially one designed for recitation. In early states, sacred narrative is not separate from governance. Divine mandate is a technology that stabilizes rule when force alone is fragile, because it turns obedience into a moral and cosmic duty. Kingship descended from heaven means the office is older than any dynasty. It means rebellion is not only treason, it is cosmic disorder, an assault on the arrangement that keeps the world intelligible. This is how ideology works at the level of daily life. If the king's authority is framed as a celestial deposit, then taxes, corvée labour, and legal judgments become extensions of sacred order. The list also solves a practical problem for later rulers. If your city is not first, you can still be legitimate by inheriting the same kingship, as though you received a sanctioned relay baton. That logic helps explain why the list is systematic rather than lyrical. It is designed to be recited, taught, and used as a scaffold for continuity, which is why the entries stay terse. Now the numbers become the next layer of that scaffold. They are so large that they push the first kings beyond ordinary human competition, beyond the reach of any rival's boast. A reign of tens of thousands of years does not only mean longevity, it signals a world of different proportions, where the first rulers are closer to origins and therefore closer to the source of legitimacy. The Sumerians counted in base 60, and that matters for how these figures feel. Sexagesimal notation makes certain multiples elegant, repeatable, and symmetrical, which gives large totals a sense of design. Base 60 is also practical, which is why it endured. 60 has many divisors, so fractions become manageable, and the same numerical habits that organize grain rations can also organize cosmic time. Many antediluvian reigns align with clean sexagesimal structures. The totals look designed to be cosmic, not measured to be historical, and that design is part of the message. This is not a modern accusation, and it is not a dismissal. Numerological structure can be a serious way of expressing order in Mesopotamian thought, because pattern itself can be evidence of meaning. In that worldview, number is not only quantity, it is quality. A patterned total can signal harmony between heaven, city, and king, even if no one ever counted those years. The list's arithmetic also creates a sense of deep time without needing narrative detail. Time becomes a monument built from repeated, imposing magnitudes, and the mind responds with awe. Notice what the text avoids. It does not describe palaces, tools, or battles, because those details would invite comparison and skepticism, while duration is harder to challenge. There are several ways scholars try to read these magnitudes responsibly. None of them removes the tension, but each clarifies what is at stake when a culture writes time this way. One approach treats the reigns as symbolic exaggeration. The earliest kings become superhuman to magnify the prestige of the institution they founded, and to place later kings in a diminished echo. Another approach asks whether the translated unit is misleading. Could the word rendered as years reflect months, seasons, or ceremonial cycles, where reign length means ritual tenure rather than lifespan? If the unit shrinks, the reigns shrink, and the kings become biologically imaginable. Yet even generous conversions often leave durations that remain extreme, which suggests that scale is still the point. A third approach treats the numbers as a coded system, not a calendar. The figures may be constructed from sacred units, then scaled to mark an age, like a mathematical costume for myth. If that is true, the list is not trying to deceive in a modern sense. It is trying to rank eras, showing that the First World was greater, more stable, and closer to divine ordering. Still, the list insists on sequence, and sequence implies memory. It names rulers, assigns them cities, and preserves an order that later scribes copied, corrected, and kept alive. Copying is important. because this text survives in multiple manuscripts. Variations exist, but the Antediluvian framework remains stable across versions, which hints at a shared cultural requirement. That stability suggests the opening was not a casual invention. It functioned as a template for how history should begin, and templates are powerful because they shape what counts as real. To picture the scribal world, imagine a schoolroom near a temple complex. Apprentices press reeds into damp clay, repeating lists until the hand learns precision and the mind learns hierarchy. The king list fits that environment. It is short enough to memorize in parts, formal enough to cite, and authoritative enough to settle arguments about precedence and rightful succession. The template has a dramatic hinge, and the hinge is a single line. The flood swept over and kingship was lowered again, an abrupt cut that feels like a door slamming shut. The flood is not described here with epic detail. It is treated like a boundary marker that separates two modes of time, the way a geological layer separates two environments. Before the flood, rains are cosmic and the world feels archetypal. After the flood, rains contract, and history begins to resemble human scale, with rulers who can be imagined as mortal. This contraction is one of the list's most important signals. It implies loss, rupture, and rebuilding, not steady progress, and it invites the listener to feel that something has been taken away. The king list is not alone in using the flood as a dividing wall. Other Mesopotamian texts treat the flood as a reset in the human story, and they do it with different emotional tones. Atrahasis frames the flood as a crisis in the relationship between gods and humans. The catastrophe is tied to governance, labour, and the limits of order, because human noise and population become political problems. In Atrahasis, the gods debate policy like administrators. They test plagues, famine, and finally the deluge, which makes the flood feel less like random wrath and more like cosmic management. The Epic of Gilgamesh preserves a flood account inside a later hero's search for meaning. The story becomes a lesson about mortality and the end of ages, because even the survivor cannot escape human limits. When Utnapishtim speaks in Gilgamesh, the flood becomes memory itself. The boat, the storm, and the silence afterward turn into a meditation on what endures when a world is erased. These texts differ in purpose, but they agree on the boundary. The flood separates a time of extraordinary conditions from a time of diminished life, and that shared boundary is culturally significant. That agreement matters, because it shows a pattern, not a single scribe's whim. The flood functions as a shared explanation for why the world changed, and why the present feels smaller than the past. It also explains why the king list can be both mythic and systematic. A boundary event allows the text to keep a ledger structure while admitting rupture, which is crucial for a history that must include catastrophe. The list does not say the antediluvian kings were gods, though later readers often assume it. It simply places them in a different time regime, where the rules of duration are not our rules. That ambiguity is productive, because it keeps multiple interpretations alive. The kings can be symbolic ancestors, remembered elites, or something stranger, and each reading still supports the list's political function. Do these reigns preserve a distorted memory of something older, perhaps even multiple collapses, compressed into a single dramatic threshold? Or are they a mythic framework that encodes how humans process catastrophe, time, and loss? The list may be less a record than a machine for meaning, built to make rupture narratable. Either way, the shape of the story is the evidence we cannot ignore. Long ages, a single catastrophe, then diminished rebuilding appears across cultures, and it raises a quiet question about human memory. That shape can emerge from shared human experience, because floods and climate shocks are common. Yet the repeated motif also invites the possibility of shared memory, carried through trade routes and migrations. The place names intensify the puzzle, because they are not abstract. Eridu, Sippar, and Shurapak sit in a landscape where rivers shift and cities endure, leaving mounds that still punctuate the plain. On a map, these names are coordinates, not symbols. You can trace them along waterways and ancient channels, and you can imagine messengers moving between them with tablets wrapped in cloth. In southern Mesopotamia, water is both lifeline and threat. A society built on canals will remember floods as existential, not incidental, because too much water destroys as surely as too little. From a scientific perspective, the alluvial plain is a sediment machine. Seasonal flooding deposits layers of silt, and over long periods those layers can bury occupations, preserve ruins, and confuse the visible timeline. Extreme floods can also be local yet unforgettable. A river avulsion can redirect flow, overwhelm levees, and turn fields into lakes, creating a disaster that feels like the world ending even if it is regional. Shuruppak is especially charged because later tradition links it to the flood hero. The king list places it as the last antediluvian seat of kingship, which makes the catastrophe feel imminent. That placement makes the flood feel like a historical event attached to a real city. It is myth anchored to a map, and that anchoring is one reason the story remains psychologically persuasive. The list also implies that kingship itself survives the catastrophe. After the flood, kingship is lowered again, as if restored from above, like a charter reissued after a fire. That restoration is a political message aimed at the present. Even after total collapse, legitimate authority can be re-established through sacred continuity, and the office can outlive the world that held it. This is why the Antediluvian section is not wasted space. It teaches that civilization is fragile, but the institution of order can return, and that return is framed as rightful rather than accidental. It also teaches hierarchy across time. The first world is vast, the later world is reduced, and the present inherits the burden of remembering, which is both privilege and warning. We should notice what the list does not do. It does not describe technologies, monuments, or explicit achievements of the first kings, because achievements can be contested and reinterpreted. Instead, it describes duration, location, and transfer of office. The greatness of the First Age is expressed as time itself, and time is the one resource no rival city can steal. That choice may reflect what survives catastrophe. Names, places, and numbers can endure when details of daily life vanish, and when oral traditions are forced to compress complexity into stable tokens. It may also reflect scribal priorities. A scribe trained in accounting will express cosmic claims through countable forms, because counting is how the state makes the world manageable. The Antediluvian section therefore becomes a test case for reading ancient texts. We must separate literal chronology from ideological structure, without discarding either, because both are part of the artifact. If the numbers are symbolic, we ask what they symbolize and why they are patterned. If they are distorted memory, we ask what could distort time so radically, and why that distortion takes a mathematical shape. If they are propaganda, we ask what political need required a past so deep. Why would legitimacy demand tens of thousands of years, and why would a society accept that demand as reasonable? The answer may be that deep time creates inevitability. A kingship older than any rival city makes present rule feel like the continuation of nature, not a temporary arrangement enforced by power. Yet the floodline prevents the story from becoming simple triumph. It admits that order can fail, and that failure can be total, which makes the return of kingship feel like recovery rather than conquest. This is where awe enters without requiring certainty. The text presents civilization as a flame that can be extinguished, then relit, and it asks us to consider how thin the wick might be. What if the oldest written history is not the beginning, but a rebuilding after earlier worlds, with the ledger format serving as a tool of reconstruction? We cannot prove 6 advanced civilizations from this list alone. We can show that Sumer framed its past as multiple scales of existence separated by catastrophe, and that framing shaped how later people understood themselves. That framing is the bridge to our next steps. We will compare the king list's boundary to other tablets, and to the physical record of floods, where sediment layers and settlement breaks can be tested. We will also watch how the idea of a world before a deluge travels across cultures. We will ask whether the similarities are diffusion, convergence, or memory, and what each option implies about human storytelling. After a sequence of these antediluvian kings, the king list hits a single line that changes everything. The flood is the seam where myth and history are stitched, and the stitches are visible if we look closely. Here is the rule for this investigation. We treat the list as evidence of meaning, then test its claims against independent lines of data, because wonder is strongest when it is disciplined. After a sequence of antediluvian kings, the king list hits its hinge line, and the tone changes like a door closing. The flood swept over, and kingship was lowered again. An official phrase that sounds simple, yet feels like history rebooted. The list does not linger on terror or weather, because it is not a poem. It is a political instrument carved to look calm, even when it describes the end of an age. In its spare accounting, the flood is not a scene, but a boundary. one line that divides the impossible longevity of the first world from the smaller, harsher arithmetic of the next. The king list gives no storm clouds, no screams, and no floating debris, only a hard cut in time. Atrahasis and Gilgamesh supply the drama, and they treat the same reset as a moral crisis rather than a clerical note. That difference matters, because it shows how cultures store catastrophe in multiple formats. One tradition compresses the event into a ledger line, while another expands it into dialogue, omen, and regret. Together, they let us watch memory harden into history, then soften back into story. Atrahasis frames the flood as policy, not accident, and that matters for interpretation. The gods respond to human expansion, noise, and labour demands, then choose a final solution when lesser measures fail. In that narrative, the problem is not evil in a modern sense, but pressure on a system. People multiply, cities thicken, and the sound of human life becomes unbearable to divine authorities. The myth translates an ecological and administrative anxiety into theology. Too many mouths, too much friction, too much strain. The story reads like administration turned cosmic, echoing the king list's ledger voice even when it becomes vivid. Catastrophe becomes governance, and survival becomes a negotiated exception shaped by warnings, secrecy, and a narrow window of mercy. Atrahasis also preserves a detail that feels almost bureaucratic in its cruelty. The gods try partial controls first, using drought, famine, and disease as throttles on population. Only when those tools fail does the flood appear as the irreversible decree. That escalation is important, because it mirrors how real societies respond to stress. Leaders rarely begin with the most extreme option, and systems often tighten in stages before they break. The myth makes that logic cosmic, as if the universe itself runs on policy memos. In Gilgamesh, the flood appears inside a different question about mortality and the limits of power. Utnapishtim tells the story as testimony, and the reset becomes a lesson about what even kings cannot escape. The framing is intimate and almost courtroom-like. Gilgamesh arrives exhausted by grief, desperate for a loophole in the human condition. Utnapishtim answers with a narrative that is both personal memory and cultural inheritance, an account offered as proof that the world can end and still continue. Here, the flood is not only punishment or management, but a revelation of scale. Human ambition, even royal ambition, cannot bargain with the deep structure of time. The survivor's immortality becomes less a prize than an isolating consequence, a reminder that exceptions come with costs. These texts are literary cousins, not identical twins, and their differences are instructive. They share a deluge, a chosen survivor, and a world that never fully returns to its earlier innocence. They also share a particular emotional geometry. There is an inside and an outside, a sealed vessel and a drowning landscape, a chosen remnant and an erased majority. That structure is simple enough to travel, yet heavy enough to carry grief across centuries. That shared structure keeps pulling us back to the central question. Do these records preserve an older memory of collapse, or do they encode how humans process loss when the ground itself becomes unreliable? To test plausibility, we start with geography, because Mesopotamia is built to flood. The Tigris and Euphrates drop from highlands into a flat alluvial plain, and that slope change turns speed into spread. From the air, the rivers look like dark threads stitched across tan earth. Their banks are slightly raised by natural levees, while the surrounding plain sits lower like a shallow bowl. When water overtops those banks, it does not fall away quickly, it drifts outward, searching for the lowest route. In the north, valleys constrain water, and floods can be fast and violent after intense rainfall or snowmelt. In the south, the land is low and broad, so water spreads and lingers, turning fields into temporary lakes. The timing of floods also matters, because it intersects with planting and harvest. A flood that arrives at the wrong week can destroy seed stores and kill livestock, even if the water recedes. In a subsistence economy, that kind of a loss is not a setback, it is a cliff. Rivers here do not stay in their lanes for long because the plain is young and mobile. Channels migrate, levees fail, and avulsions can redirect flow across fields and towns. An avulsion is not a gentle bend, but a sudden rerouting, water choosing a new path when sediment chokes the old one. Sediment is the hidden author of this landscape, building land while burying it. Each flood lays silt, raising riverbeds and increasing future overflow risk. Over centuries, that process can lift the channel above the surrounding plain, creating what engineers call a perched river. That perched condition is a quiet danger, because it turns a breach into a downhill release. Once a levee fails, gravity does the rest, and water pours into lower ground with little resistance. The floodplain becomes a receiving basin, and the river becomes a moving wall. Human engineering amplifies both safety and danger, because it concentrates flow and commits people to fixed patterns. Canals, embankments, and irrigation grids make agriculture possible, yet they also create failure points that can cascade. Early Mesopotamian irrigation was not merely a technology, but a social contract. It required coordinated labour, scheduled maintenance, and shared rules about water rights. When the system works, it creates surplus, cities, and scribes. When it fails, it can fail everywhere at once. A breach in a managed system can be worse than a natural overflow. Water follows canals like highways, turning infrastructure into a distribution network for disaster. What was designed to deliver life becomes a corridor for ruin, and the geometry of canals dictates who is hit first. Southern Mesopotamia is also close to the sea, and the coastline has not been stable through the Holocene. The Persian Gulf basin has expanded and contracted with climate and sea level, and the meeting line between river and salt water has wandered. Imagine a shoreline that is not a fixed edge, but a shifting gradient of marsh, lagoon, and tidal flat. In such terrain, a storm does not need to be extraordinary to be transformative. A few hours of wind and surge can redraw the boundary between land and water. This makes the region a natural stage for recurring inundation narratives. A society living on barely elevated ground will remember water as a civilizational threat, because the threat is not theoretical. It is seasonal, visible, and sometimes unstoppable. Now we widen the lens beyond rivers, into paleoclimate and the early Holocene. The end of the last ice age reshaped coastlines, rainfall patterns, and river regimes, and it did so on timelines that overlap with early settlement growth. As ice sheets melted, global sea level rose by more than 100 meters. That rise did not happen smoothly, and some intervals were faster than others. The ocean is not a bathtub filling at a constant rate. It responds to pulses of melt, shifting currents, and changing ice dynamics. Scientists call the fastest jumps meltwater pulses, when sea level climbed rapidly over centuries. The exact rates are debated, but the direction is not. Even a rise that seems small on paper can be enormous on a flat coast, because a centimetre of vertical change can mean kilometres of horizontal retreat. In the Gulf region, rising seas would have pushed shorelines inland. Lowlands that were once habitable plains could become marsh, lagoon, or shallow sea. Freshwater channels would back up, salinity would creep upstream, and wells could turn brackish. This matters for memory, because shoreline change can feel like a world being eaten. Communities can retreat, rebuild, then retreat again, until the old map becomes legend. At some point, the remembered homeland is not a place you can return to, but a story you can repeat. A coastal storm surge can also mimic a mythic deluge in one night. Wind-driven water can overtop barriers, especially where rivers and tides meet. When surge coincides with high river discharge, the water has nowhere to go, and the plain becomes a temporary inland sea. We do not need a single cause to explain a persistent flood tradition. A compound of hazards can produce one story, because memory compresses repeated shocks into one emblem. The mind does not archive every flood separately. It selects the worst, then lets it stand for the rest. The early Holocene was not a calm stage for early societies, even when temperatures warmed. Climate shifted, monsoons strengthened, then weakened, and river discharge patterns changed with distant rainfall. A storm system over the Anatolian highlands can become a crisis hundreds of kilometers downstream. Paleoclimate proxies give us indirect evidence, not eyewitness narrative. Ice cores, speleothems, lake sediments, and marine cores record moisture and temperature through chemistry. Oxygen isotopes, dust layers, and microfossils become a kind of natural script, written slowly and read later. These records show variability that can stress food systems and settlement stability. They also remind us that climate events can be regional, yet culturally world-ending. A drought or flood does not need to cover the planet to end a particular world of trade, ritual, and authority. At this point, the documentary rule returns, and it keeps us honest. We test texts against independent data, and we accept uncertainty where evidence runs out, or is allowed, but it has to share the room with a method. Archaeology gives us the most tangible check on flood claims. Excavations in Mesopotamia sometimes reveal flood deposits, thick silt layers between occupations. In a trench wall, the layer can look like a clean scar, fine sediment interrupting the darker, debris-rich bands of daily life. Some famous sites show such layers, including Shurapak in certain trenches. A flood layer can indicate a major event, but it cannot automatically date or map it. One deposit might represent a river breach, another a local ponding event, and another a sequence of smaller floods merged into one band. Interpreting those layers requires careful sedimentology. Grain size, sorting, and the presence of ripples can distinguish fast-moving water from quiet settling. Micro-remains can show whether the water was riverine, marshy, or influenced by marine conditions. Other sites do not show the same signal, even within the same broad period. Absence can mean no flood, or it can mean erosion, later disturbance, or missed sampling. A city might have been rebuilt quickly, scraping away the evidence, or the relevant levels might lie beneath groundwater. Flood deposits are also tricky to interpret across a flat plain. A single event can leave thick sediment in one channel zone and almost nothing on higher ground. The flood's footprint depends on microtopography, small rises that matter enormously when the landscape is nearly level. Dating adds another limit because layers can be hard to correlate precisely. Radiocarbon ranges overlap, pottery sequences shift by region, and old excavations lack modern controls. Even when dates exist, they often come with error bars that blur a single year into decades. What archaeology can support is a pattern of serious floods, not a single global deluge. The geology of Earth does not show a worldwide flood layer in recent millennia. Instead, it shows many floods, many times, each one local in mechanism and deposit. Global flood claims fail basic stratigraphy, because continents preserve long, local histories. If a planet-wide flood happened, the signal would be synchronous and unmistakable. We would expect uniform deposits of the same age across distant basins, and we do not see that pattern. We also know what large-scale flooding looks like in the record, because Earth has examples. Ancient inland seas, massive glacial outburst floods, and regional megafloods leave distinctive signatures: scoured channels, giant ripples, and thick, traceable sediment packages. The Holocene record in Mesopotamia does not match a single worldwide inundation. Instead, the evidence points to regional catastrophes, repeated over time in places where people clustered. That is enough to destroy cities, fields, and archives in a generation. It is also enough to break trust in institutions, because a water system that fails can look like a cosmos that failed. So why does the story become the flood, singular and absolute? Because storytelling networks export the most dramatic version, and drama travels farther than nuance. A tale that ends the world is easier to remember than a report about hydrology. Mesopotamia was not isolated, even in early periods, and its connectivity matters. Trade moved along rivers and coasts, and migrants carried stories as portable maps of danger and meaning. A merchant does not only transport goods, he transports warnings, metaphors, and reputations. A flood that ends a key cradle region can become a reference point for others. When a cultural centre collapses, its trauma can be adopted as a universal template. People who never saw the water can still inherit the lesson, because the lesson is about fragility. Literature then sharpens the template into a teachable form. Atrahasis turns it into population control and ethics, while Gilgamesh turns it into mortality and fate. Each version is a tool for thinking, and tools are what survive when buildings do not. The king list turns it into political chronology, and that is its own kind of theology. A reset explains why the First Age was vast and why the later age is smaller. It also legitimizes later dynasties by placing them on the far side of a cosmic audit. That hinge line is doing more than marking time. It is explaining discontinuity, and discontinuity is the most dangerous thing for a ruling order to admit. If the world can break once, it can break again. So the narrative must also promise that kingship returns, lowered again, restored. This is the narrative tension we hold without forcing a verdict. A non-global flood can still be civilization-ending if it strikes where complexity is concentrated. In a dense irrigation society, water is both the bloodstream and the weapon. In that case, the memory would not be about water alone. It would be about archives lost, irrigation grids ruined, and social order broken, then rebuilt from fragments. the scribal schools would restart, the canal schedules would be rewritten, and the new rulers would claim continuity over a gap. Consider what it means to lose records in a world where records are rare. A single inundation can erase contracts, land boundaries, and tax obligations, leaving only oral claims and force. The disaster becomes an opportunity for reordering, which is why the flood can be both tragedy and reset. The Prism's hinge line gains weight when we see how many disciplines it touches. Literature preserves meaning, geography explains vulnerability, and science constrains what is possible. The more angles we add, the more the hinge looks like a real joint between eras rather than a decorative flourish. We also keep the larger series hook in view, because it frames the stakes. What if the oldest written history is not the beginning, only the 7th attempt to rebuild? Even if we treat that as metaphor, it still asks a sharp question about how many times complexity can be lost and reassembled. The flood in this reading is less a miracle than a hard cut in cultural continuity. It marks a boundary where time is reorganized and where legitimacy must be reissued. The past becomes a different country, and the present must explain why it cannot go back. Still, we do not claim the Prism proves 6 advanced civilizations. We claim the text preserve a model of repeated collapse, and that model matches real risk. The model is sober, water rises, systems fail, survivors rebuild, and memory condenses the sequence into one decisive name. The chapter ends with a disciplined kind of awe. Civilization can be reset by water, climate, and geography, then remembered as one story that outlives the ruins. The ruins sink into silt, the silt becomes foundation, and the next city grows above the last. As the camera lingers on the plain at sunset, the rivers gleam like moving metal. You can see why the ancients treated them as divine, because they give life with one hand and take it with the other. The question that remains is not whether floods happened, but how a flood becomes history's hinge. After the floodline, the king list keeps going, and the numbers change their behaviour in a way that feels almost physical. The rains contract sharply, and the entries begin to resemble a world of human limits, measured in decades, not in impossible spans. This shift is not subtle, and it is not only arithmetic. It is a claim that the post-flood world is smaller, harsher, and less saturated with the sacred. On screen, the tablet's columns feel like a horizon line. Above it, time is mythic, and below it, time is mortal. Before the flood, time is monument-sized, and kings feel like pillars holding up creation itself. The reign lengths read like geologic eras, as if the cosmos needs a few superhuman rulers to settle into place. After the flood, time becomes countable in a lifetime, and rule becomes a contest with rivals, weather, and hunger. The list still speaks like a ledger, and that voice matters for persuasion. It presents contraction as fact, not interpretation, and the reader absorbs decline as normal. A scribe does not argue with you. He totals, he records, and he moves on, letting the numbers do the convincing. Post-flood normalization is the first key pattern we have to name, because it changes what kind of document we're reading. Reigns become shorter and more plausible, and the list begins to intersect with historically attested dynasties. The effect is like a camera pulling focus from a painted backdrop to a real street, where footprints and broken pottery start to appear. This is where the Prism starts to touch the ground of archaeology and comparative chronology. The narrative moves from cosmic preface toward a political memory that can be checked against other texts, king names, and city sequences. Even when the list is biased, it begins to share the stage with evidence that was not written to support it. The list's later sections are not perfect history, and they are not neutral, yet they increasingly overlap with names, cities, and sequences known from other sources, administrative tablets, dedicatory inscriptions, and later chronicles that echo similar successions. That overlap does not prove every line, but it changes the odds that we are dealing with pure invention. In Mesopotamia, chronology is assembled like a mosaic, because no single source is complete. Scholars compare king lists, year names, and layers of settlement debris, then test whether the order of rulers matches the order of material change. When the king list aligns with independent sequences, it gains a kind of traction, limited but real. That traction changes the question we ask about the earlier impossibilities. It suggests the text is not random fantasy, but a structured bridge between mythic time and recorded time. The bridge is built from a simple tool, numbers that shrink as if the world itself is losing altitude. The bridge has a direction, and the direction is downward. The world shrinks in reign lengths, and the shrinking is treated as the expected aftermath of catastrophe. The flood is not just a storm in the story, it is a boundary between two operating systems of reality. This is the motif of decline, and it is bigger than Mesopotamia. Cultures repeatedly imagine a lost golden age, then a thinning of longevity, then a fading of knowledge. The details vary, but the emotional geometry stays remarkably consistent. An arc from fullness to scarcity. The pattern appears in different costumes, but the emotional logic stays consistent. The ancestors are closer to origins and therefore stronger, wiser, and longer lived. In a world where origins are sacred, distance from the beginning can feel like distance from power. We should ask why decline is such a durable story shape, especially when it appears in societies with very different technologies. It is not only nostalgia, and it's not only moral preaching. It is also a way to make discontinuity intelligible, because the mind prefers gradients to chaos. Mythic decline works as a cognitive map for trauma and discontinuity. It tells survivors that the world did not merely change, it diminished, and the loss is measurable. A measurable loss can be mourned, compared, and explained, even when the cause feels too large for language. A catastrophe that breaks continuity also breaks confidence in meaning. Decline narratives restore meaning by turning shock into a timeline with a direction. Before was greater, after is less. That direction is a kind of handrail, something to hold on to when memory is jagged. They also solve a social problem that follows collapse, which is the temptation to conclude that order never existed. If institutions fail, people need an explanation that preserves the idea of order itself. Otherwise, every promise becomes suspect and every rule looks like a temporary trick. Decline says order was real, but it was damaged. It says the present is not proof that the past was false, only proof that something was taken. The story does not deny suffering. It frames suffering as evidence that the world has fallen from a higher state. That framing can be psychologically stabilizing, even when it's historically untestable. It allows grief to become structure, and structure to become identity. A community can say, "We are the ones who endured the shrinking," and that sentence can hold a people together. It also helps elites govern after disruption, and this is where myth becomes policy. If the past was greater, then rebuilding requires obedience, discipline, and respect for inherited forms. The argument is subtle. You do not invent your way back to greatness, you recover it. The King List expresses this with numbers rather than sermons, which is part of its power. Shorter reigns imply weaker bodies, weaker institutions, and a thinner connection to the divine. The page does not scold, yet it implies that something essential has drained away. The contraction also functions as a calibration device, and we should not miss the technical elegance of that move. It brings the story into the range where human memory and human politics can operate. Once the figures fit within plausible lifespans, the list can begin to act like a usable record. Once reigns are plausible, the list can do its second job more effectively. It can rank cities, legitimate dynasties, and narrate transfers of kingship as lawful. Kingship in this tradition is not merely a throne. It is a portable authority that can be said to move, like a sacred office. The order does not disappear when the numbers shrink. It changes shape, because the miracle becomes survival, not superhuman duration. In a harsher world, continuing the chain at all becomes the wonder, one reign after another, despite famine, conflict, and floodplain disease. Now we connect the motif to systems, because collapse is not only a story told after the fact. Complex societies are networks, and networks can fail faster than individuals expect. The more interdependent the system becomes, the more a local break can propagate outward. Complexity and collapse basics begin with specialization, which is both a strength and a vulnerability. When tasks are divided, knowledge becomes deep, but it also becomes dependent on coordination. A society gains experts, yet it loses redundancy, and that trade-off matters in crisis. A canal engineer, a scribe, a metal worker, and a caravan organizer are not interchangeable. Their skills are powerful, yet each relies on the other's continuity, tools, and training pipelines. If one link fails, the others can keep working for a while, but not indefinitely. Trade is the next layer of dependency, and in Mesopotamia it is not optional decoration. Cities import stone, timber, metals, and luxury goods, and they export grain, textiles, and crafted items. The river plain is fertile, but it is also materially constrained, which makes exchange a lifeline. When trade routes break, the loss is not only wealth, it is the disappearance of materials that local landscapes cannot replace. Hard stone for tools, copper and tin for bronze, timber for beams and boats. A city can still stand, but it begins to improvise, patch, and substitute. Administration is another layer that looks boring until it fails, and the king list comes from that administrative mentality. Taxes, rations, labour drafts, and land boundaries are the glue that keeps surplus organised. When a state can count grain and assign work, it can build canals, walls, and temples. When archives burn or flood, the state loses its memory, and that is not metaphor. Without records, obligations become disputes, and disputes become violence or fragmentation. A farmer who cannot prove a boundary, or a worker who cannot prove a ration, is pushed into conflict. Collapse does not require every building to fall, and it rarely looks like a single dramatic moment. It can arrive as a slow failure of coordination, where each local decision makes the whole less stable. People adapt rationally to scarcity, yet the combined adaptations unravel the system. A flood that breaches levees can destroy fields in weeks, and the camera can linger on the geometry of damage. Water cuts new channels, salt rises into the topsoil, and the neat grid of irrigation becomes a scarred mirror. The deeper damage is that it can break schedules, trust, and the ability to mobilize repair labor. A drought can do the same through different mechanics, and the science is straightforward. It reduces yields, forces migration, and turns political promises into empty ritual. When rain fails repeatedly, even a well-managed canal system cannot conjure water that is not there. In either case, complexity becomes fragile because it depends on surplus. When surplus shrinks, specialists must return to subsistence, and their knowledge becomes harder to maintain. Skills that require constant practice, surveying, metallurgy, large-scale accounting, atrophy when daily survival consumes the calendar. This is one way to read the king list's shrinking reins without forcing literalism. The numbers can encode a memory of demographic stress and institutional thinning. They can also encode a worldview that catastrophe reduces the human scale, and that reduction is the new baseline. Shorter reigns can imply shorter lifespans, but they can also imply shorter stability. A king who cannot hold power long may reflect a world of succession crises, rival factions, and contested legitimacy. In unstable conditions, the problem is not only dying sooner, it is being replaced sooner. Succession crises are not only palace drama, even though they can look like it in later storytelling. They are moments when networks are renegotiated, and renegotiation can break supply lines and local loyalties. A new ruler may need to reward supporters quickly, which can drain reserves and inflame resentment. A diminished world also changes how knowledge is transmitted, and this is where the human voice returns. After collapse, oral tradition becomes more important, because institutions that train specialists may be interrupted. When schools close and archives scatter, memory travels in bodies, through recitation, apprenticeship, and ritual. Oral transmission is resilient, but it is also selective, and that selectivity shapes what survives. It preserves what can be performed, repeated, and socially rewarded, and it lets other details evaporate. A list of kings can survive as a chant, while the economic logic behind a canal schedule disappears. This brings us to a crucial hinge inside the hinge. The post-flood era is also the era when writing becomes the dominant storage technology for states. In Mesopotamia, that means clay tablets, reed styluses, and the slow standardization of scribal training, tools that can outlast dynasties. From oral to written is not a simple upgrade, and the trade-offs are subtle. Writing preserves some knowledge with precision, while freezing other aspects into ritual and legend. A spoken account can flex with new circumstances, but a written one can harden into a formula. A written list can outlive the people who understand its original context, and this is one reason old texts become strange. It can be copied faithfully, even when the meaning of its numbers becomes opaque. A scribe may reproduce a reign length because it is traditional, not because it is believable. Writing also changes authority, and the change is visible in how communities argue. A spoken tradition can adapt to new conditions, but a written text can become a fixed reference that resists revision. Once a tablet exists, disagreement becomes a matter of interpretation, not recollection. That resistance can protect memory, and it can also fossilize it. A community may keep repeating a formula long after its practical rationale is gone. The words remain, the cadence remains, and the original context fades like a landscape under sand. Scribble culture therefore becomes a kind of time machine with limits. It carries forward names, sequences, and claims, but it cannot guarantee comprehension. The machine preserves signals, yet it also preserves noise, and later readers must decide which is which. The King List is a perfect example of this double effect, because it is both record and argument. It preserves a chain of kingship, yet it also preserves a model of decline as the default condition. The tablet does not merely remember rulers, it teaches the reader how to feel about time. In that model, the flood is not only a disaster, it is the turning point where the human condition becomes narrower and where greatness recedes into prehistory. The story implies that what is oldest is not only earlier, it is larger and therefore more authoritative. We should notice how useful that model is for explaining everyday hardship, especially in a landscape where survival depends on fragile infrastructure. If life is shorter and politics are messier, decline gives a reason that feels cosmic. It says the hardship is not random, it is the world's new shape. It also gives a reason to keep looking backward for legitimacy, and this is central to how dynasties present themselves. If the first age was greater, then the past becomes a resource, not a burden. A king can claim continuity with an earlier order, even if the continuity is mostly symbolic. This is where the series hook returns with new pressure, and it lands differently after we understand the mechanism. What if the oldest written history is not the beginning of civilization, only the 7th attempt to rebuild it? The question is provocative because rebuilding is a real pattern, even without literal cycles. Even if we treat that as metaphor, it still describes a real dynamic. Rebuilding often happens on top of ruins, with partial knowledge and borrowed forms. A new administration may inherit broken canals, scattered people, and a few surviving scribes, enough to restart but not enough to restore the old scale. The King List's post-flood realism does not cancel the Antediluvian strangeness. It frames it as the lost scale that the present cannot reach. The earlier kings become a measuring stick, and the later kings become a record of how far the world has fallen. That framing is the message of decline, and it is also a warning. If the world can shrink once, then stability is not guaranteed by progress. The list quietly implies that complexity is reversible, and that reversal can feel like a law of history. Now, we widen the lens beyond Mesopotamia, but we do it carefully. Similar motifs can come from shared contact, or from shared human constraints. The same shape can travel along trade routes, or it can arise independently when societies face comparable shocks. A golden age followed by decline can spread through diffusion, and diffusion does not require conquest. Traders and migrants can carry a story template as easily as they carry tools. A narrative can move as a proverb, a ritual phrase, or a prestige tale repeated at a foreign court. The same motif can also arise independently through convergence, because human cognition has its own pressures. Any society that experiences collapse can imagine the past as larger and the present as reduced. When a parent tells a child, "It used to be better," the sentence is already a miniature decline myth. Our central question sits inside that ambiguity, and we do not escape it here. Do these traditions preserve real memory of multiple advanced civilizations? Or do they encode how humans process catastrophe, time, and loss? The answer may not be a single switch, because memory and meaning can coexist in the same story. The King List gives us a measurable decline in reign lengths, and measurement is the key word. Cross-cultural myth gives us a repeated idea that humans used to be more, not merely different. Systems theory gives us a plausible pathway for losing complexity quickly, especially when interdependence is high. Writing gives us a way to preserve the claim, even as context decays. It also gives later societies a reason to treat the claim as inherited fact, because the tablet looks like evidence. A written number has a stubborn authority, even when it is a symbolic number. Put together, the motif stops looking like a decorative theme. It becomes a tool for surviving discontinuity and for governing after a reset. It tells people what happened, what it meant, and what kind of obedience might bring order back. Here is the rule for this investigation, applied to decline as well as floods. We treat the motif as evidence of meaning, then test it against independent patterns. We listen to what the story is doing psychologically and politically, Then we ask what the material record allows. If decline is only myth, it still reveals how humans interpret a broken world. If decline is partly memory, it may point to real episodes of demographic and infrastructural loss. Either way, the Prism's quiet arithmetic becomes a map of vulnerability, and the map is worth reading. It suggests that civilization can contract, and that contraction can feel like the universe itself is receding. When reigns shorten, the future feels shorter too, less guaranteed, less spacious, more contested. The tablet becomes a mirror held up to every society that assumes its systems will always hold. We leave the river plain and follow the shrinking world motif east, into India's deep time. The camera lifts from mud brick and reed boats, then glides over monsoon fields and stone temples, landscapes where memory is layered like sediment. The Hindu Yuga framework is not a king list, yet it speaks the same language. It describes long ages, a turning point, and a late, diminished present. The central question stays in view as we shift traditions and vocabulary. Do these cycles preserve memories of earlier high civilizations, or do they encode how humans process catastrophe, time, and loss? The Yugas will not answer that alone, but they sharpen the pattern. They also force us to ask how a society imagines before, when ordinary records cannot reach. In classical Hindu thought, time is not a straight road with a single destination. Time is a wheel that turns through repeating phases, carrying worlds through rise, decline, and renewal. The Yugas are the most famous articulation of that wheel. In Sanskrit, the language of the texts, the word yuga can mean an age, a yoke, or a joining. An image of time is something that binds eras together. The four Yugas are Satya, Treta, Dvapara, and Kali. They are not merely dates on a calendar, but moral climates. Each age is defined by a reduction in virtue, social cohesion, and human capacity. The tradition often pictures Dharma as a bull that stands on 4 legs in Satya Yuga, then loses a leg in each successive age, an image that makes decline visible, not abstract. Satya Yuga is the age of truth and full Dharma. It is imagined as stable, luminous, and close to the source. Human life is longer, insight is clearer, and order is less dependent on coercion. In visual terms, it is a world of clear water and unbroken horizons, where trust is not naive, because deception is rare. Treta Yuga follows as a first contraction from that fullness. Dharma is reduced, and sacrifice and discipline become more necessary. The world still holds greatness, but it now requires effort to maintain. The ideal shifts from effortless harmony to cultivated order, as if society must now practice what it once breathed naturally. Dvapara Yuga continues the decline and introduces deeper mixture and conflict. Knowledge becomes partial, institutions become more brittle, and power becomes more contested. The age is not darkness, but it is no longer whole. It is the era of arguments, factions, and competing authorities, where truth is still present, yet harder to recognize in the noise. Kali Yuga is the final and harshest phase of the cycle. Virtue is at its lowest, confusion is widespread, and stability is hardest to sustain. The tradition often places us here, late in the sequence, living after the best has receded. If Satya feels like sunrise, Kali is the dim hour before dawn, when shadows stretch and small choices carry disproportionate weight. This is the first resonance with the Sumerian pattern. The king list moves from impossible reigns to human limits after the floodline. The Yugas move from a moral and cognitive golden age to a compressed, troubled present. Both stories make the past feel taller, as if earlier humans stood closer to the sky. The engine of history in the Yuga model is not technological progress. It is ethical and spiritual decline, expressed in social breakdown and diminished perception. The story insists that what changes first is the human interior, then the human world. In modern terms, it treats culture as a system where values shape institutions, and institutions shape survival. That claim can be read as theology, philosophy, or social diagnosis. It can also be read as a memory framework for collapse, where the felt loss of order becomes a cosmic rule. Either reading keeps us inside disciplined wonder rather than forced literalism. The point is not to win an argument, but to see what kind of argument the tradition is making. To understand why the Yugas feel so vast, we have to look at their numbers. Ancient Indian timekeeping includes ordinary scales, yet it also reaches outward to cosmic durations. It treats time as something that can be counted, then multiplied beyond intuition. The mind is invited to climb from days and months to spans so large they resemble astronomy and geology. In many presentations, each yuga has a set length measured in years, with a clear ratio. Satya is longest, then Treta, then Dvapara, then Kali. The proportions often follow a 4, 3, 2, 1 pattern, like a controlled descent. That ratio functions like a metronome for decline, making the sequence feel designed rather than accidental. A common traditional scheme assigns 4,220,000 years to a full cycle of 4 yugas. In that scheme, Satya lasts 1,128,000 years, Treta lasts 1,396,000 years, Dvapara lasts 864,000 years, and Kali lasts 432,000 years. The numbers are not random, and their structure is part of their argument. They are built from repeating factors, and they reward the listener who notices pattern. The scale is so large that it can feel like geology, not history. That is the point for many interpreters within the tradition. The Yugas describe cosmic time, where human societies are episodes inside a larger rhythm. When the narration names millions of years, the visuals can linger on eroding cliffs and river deltas, slow processes that do not care about dynasties. The mathematics works through multiplication and patterned digits, and it invites numeracy as devotion. A number like 432,000 is not only a quantity, but a symbol of order. It signals that the cosmos is intelligible, even when the present feels chaotic. Numbers become a kind of architecture, clean lines drawn across the fog of experience. We should notice the parallel to Mesopotamia's sexagesimal taste for structured enormity. The king list uses base 60 patterning to make deep time feel official and countable. The Yuga scheme uses ratios and repeating motifs to make deep time feel lawful. In both, arithmetic is not decoration. It is a claim that reality has a hidden grammar. In both cases, the numbers do not merely report duration. They create a mood of inevitability and scale, and they train the listener to accept decline as part of the design. Arithmetic becomes narrative, and narrative becomes a kind of governance of the mind. When a culture can count the ages, it can also endure them, because endurance feels like participation in an order. Yet we also have to draw a careful boundary, because the documentary is educational, not credulous. Many historians and Indologists treat yuga durations as cosmological, not literal chronology. The point is not that someone measured millions of years, but that they imagined time in millions. That imagination matters, because it reveals what a civilization thought time was for. That distinction matters for our central question. A cosmology can resemble a historical record without being one. Similar structures can arise because humans face similar problems, not because they share a single lost archive. When writing is young and disasters erase archives, the mind reaches for models that can survive erasure. Still, the resemblance is not trivial, and it deserves analysis rather than dismissal. The Yugas and the King list both place a vast, elevated before time behind a rupture. They both compress toward the present, where life is shorter, conflict is sharper, and rebuilding is constant. The emotional geometry is the same, a long slope downward, then a narrow ledge where we stand. In the Yuga model, the turning is not always a flood, but it is always a threshold. Each transition marks a reduction in dharma and an increase in friction. The world does not simply change, it degrades in a patterned way. The pattern implies that decline is not merely political mismanagement, it is woven into the fabric of the era. That pattern creates a powerful psychological effect. If decline is built into the cycle, then suffering is not meaningless noise. It is a known phase, which can be endured without concluding that reality is random. The model offers a map for grief, and maps reduce panic even when they cannot prevent the storm. This is the cultural function of cyclical time, and it helps explain its persistence. Cycles stabilize communities after catastrophe by making recurrence expectable. They also preserve hope by implying that decline is not the final word. Even a harsh age becomes a chapter, not the whole book. A linear story can make collapse feel like total failure. A cyclical story can make collapse feel like winter, severe but not permanent. The emotional difference is enormous, even when the material damage is the same. One story says, "We fell," while the other says, "We're in the cold season, so plant accordingly." Cyclical time also changes responsibility, and this is where the model becomes ethically complex. If an age is destined to be dark, people can excuse corruption as inevitable. Yet the same model can demand discipline, because virtue is portrayed as harder and therefore more meaningful. In a degraded age, a small act of integrity can be framed as heroic precisely because the current runs against it. The Yuga framework often holds both impulses at once. It warns that the age is degraded, then insists that right action still matters. The darkness is not permission to abandon order, but a reason to protect it. The listener is left with a hard question. If the era is heavy, what does it mean to carry anything at all? This is another echo of the kingless post-flood world. After the hinge line, the reigns are shorter and the world is harsher, yet kingship continues. The miracle becomes continuity under pressure, not perfection. Survival becomes the proof of legitimacy, because the old grandeur is no longer available. We also need to address how these ideas travel and change over time. The Yugas appear across a long textual tradition, with variations in emphasis and calculation. Some accounts focus on moral decline, others on astronomical cycles, and others on ritual calendars. The concept is stable enough to be recognizable, yet flexible enough to serve different communities. The diversity is important because it shows a living framework, not a single fixed chart. People use the Yugas to think with, and thinking tools adapt. A framework that survives centuries will accumulate interpretations, debates, and local applications. The same word can carry philosophy in one context and social critique in another, without losing its core shape. Astronomy and cosmology are often intertwined in these discussions, and we should be precise. Indian astronomical traditions developed sophisticated models for planetary motion and calendrics. The Yuga concept sometimes intersects with those models, but it is not reducible to them. The sky becomes a reference point, not because it proves the ages, but because it lends the ages a sense of cosmic regularity. Here, the visuals can shift to star charts and slow-moving planets, Jupiter's bright arc, Saturn's patient crawl. Ancient observers did not need telescopes to notice cycles, and cycles invite larger cycles. When you watch the heavens repeat, it is tempting to imagine history repeating too. The temptation is to treat big numbers as either proof of advanced science or proof of pure fantasy. Both reactions are too simple for what the texts are doing. The numbers can be symbolic, structured, and culturally functional without being modern measurements. They can also preserve a sense of scale that ordinary political history cannot provide. This is where disciplined wonder becomes method again. We can be awed by the scale of imagination and the rigor of patterning. We can also refuse to convert that awe into a claim the evidence cannot support. Wonder is not the enemy of skepticism. When it is trained, it becomes a lens. Now we return to the series hook, because it is the pressure behind every comparison. What if the oldest written history is not the beginning of civilization, only the seventh attempt to rebuild it? The Yugas do not say 6 civilizations, yet they do say late. And that lateness carries the same existential weight. It is the feeling of arriving after the library burned and being asked to rebuild from ash. To live in Kali Yuga, in the traditional view, is to inherit a world already worn down. The best capacities are behind us, and the task is preservation under decline. That is psychologically close to the king list's implied message after the flood. The present is framed as a salvage operation, keeping what can be kept and passing it forward intact. The similarity could be diffusion, but the direct pathway is not obvious. Mesopotamia and India interacted through trade and migration in later periods, yet the deepest layers of these ideas are difficult to date. Convergence remains a serious possibility. When two distant cultures build similar scaffolding for time, we should ask what shared human pressures might be doing the building. Convergence has its own explanation, rooted in human experience of collapse. When societies suffer disruption, they often imagine a prior wholeness. When memory is broken, people rebuild identity by placing the break inside a larger order. The mind wants continuity, and if it cannot find it in archives, it will craft it in cosmology. A golden age is a way to say that order once existed. A decline sequence is a way to say that today's hardship has a reason. A cycle is a way to say that the reason is not only political but cosmic. The logic is emotionally efficient, and that efficiency helps it spread. This is why the Yugas resonate even for people who do not read them as literal history. They give a vocabulary for the feeling that something has been lost, and that loss is not merely personal. The framework turns private anxiety into shared structure. It translates the ache of things are worse into a story with boundaries and meaning. The Yugas also function as critique, aimed at the present. By defining the age as degraded, the tradition creates a mirror for corruption, violence, and forgetfulness. It warns that decline is not only out there in fate, but inside habits and institutions. The critique is sharp because it is cosmic. If the whole age is sick, then personal excuses sound smaller. That critique can be mobilized by reformers, priests and rulers alike. It can justify strictness as necessary medicine for a sick age. It can also empower dissent by naming the gap between ideals and reality. When a society agrees that the age is difficult, it becomes possible to argue about what discipline should look like. In Mesopotamia, the king list legitimizes kingship by placing it inside cosmic continuity. In India, the Yuga model can legitimize dharma by placing ethics inside cosmic time. Both frameworks bind social order to a larger structure that feels older than argument. When order is framed as ancient, disagreement can be treated as rebellion against time itself. We should also acknowledge what the Yugas do not provide. They do not give a list of cities, rulers and reigns that can be cross-checked like later parts of the king list. They are not written as administrative chronology, and they do not pretend to be. Their authority is not archival, but conceptual, more like a theory of history than a ledger. That difference protects us from a category mistake. If we treat Yugas as literal annals, we will force them into a role they never claimed. If we treat them as pure fiction, we will miss their function as cultural memory and moral architecture. The middle position is not indecision, it is accuracy about genre. So we hold the middle position. The Yugas are philosophical cosmology with numerical discipline, not a straightforward timeline of empires. Their power lies in structure, not in verifiable dates. They teach a way of seeing, and ways of seeing can shape civilizations as strongly as laws. Structure is exactly what matters for our comparative thread. The king list gives deep time, then a hard reset, then contraction. The Yugas give deep time, then transitions, then contraction of virtue and capacity. Both systems imply that we live after a fall, and that rebuilding is the human condition. Both systems suggest that the past was larger than the present, and that the future depends on what we carry forward. That is the conclusion theme in another register. If the ages are shrinking, then memory becomes a technology, one that must work without machines and sometimes without books. If India and Sumer share a shrinking world structure, we have to ask how often that structure appears elsewhere. We have to ask whether it is a universal human template. The question is not only where the story came from, but why the story keeps returning. The bridge forward is careful and explicit. The Yugas are not proof of 6 advanced civilizations before ours. They are evidence that multiple cultures imagine long epochs, a turning and a diminished rebuilding phase. That evidence is subtle, but it is real, because it is a repeatable shape. That raises the next question with renewed force. How often does humanity independently invent the same story, and why does it feel true? If the shape repeats across continents, then the shape itself becomes a clue. Is it a cognitive pattern, a response to disaster, or a shadow cast by events too old to document? We move west into the Mediterranean, where Greece keeps its own ledger of decline, etched into poetry instead of stone. The Aegean light is sharp and the sea looks eternal, yet the human story in Hesiod feels brittle. Hesiod does not list kings with reign lengths, yet he lists humanity itself, as if the species were a dynasty. His ages of man feel like another staircase downward, from abundance toward strain and from intimacy toward distance. The central question stays unchanged as the setting changes, even as the names and symbols shift. Do these sequences preserve memory of real resets, or encode how humans process loss when the world stops cooperating? Hesiod's framework begins with the Golden Age, a world of ease and nearness that sounds almost ecological. People live without grinding labour, and the earth yields without relentless extraction, as if soil fertility were infinite. In modern terms, it resembles a system with high surplus and low risk, where energy inputs are small. Death arrives like sleep, not like a violent theft of years, and that detail matters for tone. The gods feel closer, and the distance between desire and fulfillment feels small, like a short walk. In decline myths, that closeness is always the first thing to thin, before hunger even appears. Visually, the Golden Age is painted in soft edges, fields that do not need ploughs, orchards heavy with fruit and people unarmed. The air is calm, and the soundscape is birds and water, not hammering and shouting. Hesiod's gold is not just wealth, but a texture of life where friction is low. Anthropologists might call it an imagined baseline, a memory of stability projected backward into myth. The point is not whether it happened exactly, but why humans keep needing it as a reference. If you can imagine a world without constant effort, then your present effort becomes a kind of exile. The Silver Age follows as a second humanity, weaker in discipline and less aligned with divine order. Childhood stretches long, then adulthood arrives without wisdom to match it, like growth without maturation. The image suggests a society that cannot complete its training cycle, where learning does not harden into responsibility. People fail to honour the gods, and the age ends in divine displeasure, which functions like a moral verdict. The story shifts from effortless provision to moral mismatch, and that shift is subtle. A world can still be rich, yet become unstable when reverence and restraint collapse, because abundance alone does not regulate behaviour. In the Silver Age, the camera would linger on ritual neglected, altars with cold ash, offerings left unmade, and a community that forgets its own calendar. The myth implies that social cohesion depends on shared limits, even when food is available. In political terms, legitimacy is the invisible infrastructure that keeps a system from tearing itself apart. Hesiod frames impiety as the cause, but the mechanism resembles something broader. When a culture stops believing in its own constraints, it begins to spend its future in advance. Then Hesiod turns to the Bronze Age, and the metaphor hardens into metal with a clang we can almost hear. This humanity is built for conflict, and its tools and homes are bronze, bright and unforgiving. Bronze is an alloy, usually copper and tin, and that chemistry matters because it requires trade networks. Tin is scarce in many regions, so bronze implies roots, merchants and organised extraction, not just local craft. Their strength is real, yet it is aimed toward violence and self-destruction, as if power has lost a purpose. They do not eat bread in the familiar civil sense, and they feel closer to raw force than to cultivated life. The Bronze Age ends by its own hand, as if war is a technology that consumes its makers. The visual language is shields and spear points, smoke rising from palisades, and the metallic glare of a sun on helmets. Hesiod's bronze world is loud, and it is heavy, and it is hungry for enemies. In a systems view, it resembles an arms race, where security demands ever more production of weapons. The tragedy is that the same coordination that builds cities can also organise slaughter. When the story says they destroyed themselves, it reads like a warning about feedback loops that spiral. Hesiod inserts an interruption that complicates simple decline, and it matters for our method. The Age of Heroes is not a metal, and it is not merely worse, which makes it feel like a remembered exception. It is a partial recovery of greatness, framed through epic memory and named lineages, like a genealogy of intensity. These are the figures of Thebes and Troy, where courage and tragedy coexist in the same breath. Some heroes die in war, yet some are granted a blessed afterlife, and the narrative pauses to honour them. The sequence admits that history is uneven, and that peaks can rise inside a downward slope. This heroic interlude also hints at how cultures preserve what institutions cannot. Epics are portable archives, carried in voices when libraries burn or administrations fall. A singer can keep a catalogue of ships longer than a palace can keep its ledgers, if the palace collapses. The heroic age therefore feels like a bridge between myth and memory, where the past is still reachable through story. Visually, we see painted pottery scenes, chariots, duels, and funerary games, where identity is performed in public. Hesiod is not giving us a census, but he is giving us a cultural fingerprint of what mattered. Finally comes the Iron Age, and Hesiod speaks like a man living inside it, not merely describing it from afar. Iron is harder, more common, and less precious than gold, and it changes the economics of tools. It holds an edge, yet it lacks the radiance of the First Age, and the contrast is deliberate. The defining features are toil, injustice, and the feeling of fading greatness, as if the air itself is heavier. Work becomes constant, trust becomes risky, and social bonds become transactional, measured in advantage. Hesiod predicts a future where shame and righteous anger leave the earth, and the human world becomes colder. The Iron Age is not only economic hardship, even if it includes it in every line. It is a moral climate where oaths break and power ignores limits, and that climate shapes daily decisions. Parents and children turn against each other, and hospitality loses its sacred weight, which is a civilizational alarm. In a world of small farms and fragile harvests, hospitality is insurance against bad luck, so its loss is structural. The complaint is not that life is difficult, but that meaning is unstable and that instability corrodes courage. In this age, the problem is not only hunger, and it is not only fatigue. The problem is that fairness no longer feels guaranteed by the cosmos, and that feeling changes everything. To understand why iron becomes Hesiod's emblem, we can add a little material science without breaking the spell. Ironworking requires higher temperatures than simple copper smelting, and it demands controlled furnaces and skilled handling. Early iron often came from meteorites or bloomery furnaces, and it had to be hammered and refined with patience. That makes iron both accessible and demanding, common ore, but difficult mastery. The metaphor fits because the age is full of effort, and effort does not always yield dignity. The tool is stronger, yet the hand that holds it feels more burdened. Metals are the chapter's first key mechanism because they compress a theory of history into a sequence you can hold. Value decreases as hardness increases, and the trade-off is the point, not a contradiction. Gold is soft and precious, like abundance that does not need force, and like status that does not need proof. Iron is strong and useful, like survival that requires pressure and discipline, and like a life built around necessity. The metaphor says that later ages may be more capable of cutting and building, yet less capable of living well. Progress in technique can coincide with decline in trust, and that paradox is one of the oldest human observations. This is where Greece converges with Mesopotamia and India, without copying their forms or their vocabulary. Sumer measures decline through shrinking rains after a flood boundary, turning myth into arithmetic. India measures decline through Dharma losing legs across the Yugas, turning ethics into cosmic geometry. Greece measures decline through metals and morals, then anchors it in daily labour, sweat, and social fracture. Different metaphors point toward the same intuition, and the repetition is hard to ignore. The past was larger, the present is narrower, and something essential has drained away, like a river in drought. We should name what these systems share because the overlap is structural rather than decorative. Each tradition imagines an elevated before time that cannot be recovered by effort alone, which limits human pride. Each tradition imagines a turning point, whether flood, transition, or divine judgment, that divides then from now. Each tradition frames the present as late, burdened, and morally complicated, where choices feel constrained. That shared geometry is the evidence we can actually compare, because it is pattern, not detail. It does not prove lost super-civilizations, yet it does prove a repeated human way of mapping time when continuity breaks. Now we introduce the second key mechanism, and it is not a metal. It is fire, the ancient symbol for technology, craft, and stored power, and it glows in myth like a living thing. In Greek myth, Prometheus steals fire and gives it to humans, and the theft is an ethical rupture. The gift is not only warmth and cooking, but metallurgy, tools, and the capacity to reshape nature with intention. Fire is the hinge between helplessness and agency, because it turns raw materials into instruments. It is also the hinge between innocence and consequence, because it makes humans responsible for what they can now do. Prometheus is punished, and the punishment frames knowledge as costly, in a way that feels almost modern. Zeus chains him, and an eagle consumes his liver in an endless cycle, a brutal image of renewal and debt. The myth insists that technology is not neutral, even when it begins as aid. It can violate a boundary, create new dependencies, and provoke new forms of control, including political control. A gift can arrive with a bill that cannot be refused, and the bill can be paid across generations. The story is not about a campfire, and it is not about comfort alone. It is about the price of becoming a species that builds, measures, and transforms. If we translate fire into practical terms, it is a portable energy source and a chemical tool. With fire, you sterilize water, preserve food, harden clay, and extract metal from ore, which is chemistry disguised as myth. Controlled heat makes adhesives, pigments, and glass, and it expands what a community can store and trade. Yet every one of those gains depends on stable practice and shared instruction, not just a spark. The Prometheus story compresses that dependency into a single dramatic act, then asks us to notice the consequences. What happens when a society can change its environment faster than it can change its ethics? Humans also receive Pandora, and the myth links innovation to unintended release with a chilling simplicity. A jar is opened, and troubles spread into the world, as if complexity itself has escaped containment. Hope remains, yet it is ambiguous whether hope comforts or prolongs suffering, and that ambiguity is part of the lesson. The pairing is deliberate, and it is almost like a thought experiment. Fire expands capability, and Pandora expands complexity of consequence, including consequences no one voted for. In this framing, civilization is a bargain, and bargains have fine print. It brings power, then brings problems that power cannot fully solve, because new tools create new vulnerabilities. This matters for our series question, because fire is not guaranteed to stay lit, even when the myth makes it feel eternal. Modern people assume knowledge accumulates, because we live inside archives and networks that copy themselves. Ancient myths repeatedly warn that knowledge can be lost, stolen, or withdrawn, and that warning is not irrational. Fire can be taken back or become unusable when systems fail, when fuel is scarce, or when specialists disappear. A society can forget how to do what it once did, even if the ruins remain visible. The loss does not require malice or conspiracy, and it does not require a single dramatic night. It can follow famine, war, migration, and the collapse of training, one broken link at a time. Here the Greek stories touch the same systems logic we built in Mesopotamia, where complexity depends on continuity. Complex skills require specialists, tools, and stable transmission, and those requirements are fragile under stress. When surplus disappears, specialists return to subsistence and practice disappears, because time becomes food. When institutions fracture, apprenticeships break and standards drift, and the craft becomes rumour. When trade routes fail, materials vanish and techniques become pointless, because the inputs cannot arrive. Fire is therefore both symbol and model, and the model is sobering. It stands for the fragile chain that carries know-how across generations, and for how easily that chain can snap. Hesiod's Iron Age complaint can be read as moral preaching, yet it also fits collapse experience with uncanny precision. After disruption, people work harder for less, and social trust erodes because survival becomes competitive. Inequality sharpens, and violence becomes a rational strategy for survival, not merely a vice. Courts become corrupt, and oaths become negotiable, because enforcement weakens and fear rises. The myth translates those pressures into a cosmic diagnosis, which makes them feel inevitable. It says the age itself is heavy, and the heaviness shapes behaviour, even before anyone chooses to be cruel. We should not pretend Greece is reporting a literal sequence of global epochs, because that would be a category error. Hesiod is writing poetry with a social purpose, and genre matters when we evaluate evidence. He is instructing, warning, and persuading, and he is also preserving a mood. Yet the structure still counts as evidence of how decline is remembered and how it is taught. The ages of man are a cultural instrument for explaining why life feels worse and for urging restraint inside that feeling. They also preserve a memory that greatness existed, even if it cannot be dated or excavated. In that sense, the poem functions like a king list's arithmetic, because it makes loss feel orderly and therefore discussable. Now we test the convergence question directly, because it is the methodological hinge of the whole series. Similar decline myths can spread by diffusion through trade, migration, and prestige culture, and the Mediterranean is a dense web. Sailors carry stories the way they carry oil and wine, and ports translate them quickly. Yet similar myths can also arise without contact, through convergence, because humans face similar constraints. Collapse produces predictable sensations, and humans convert sensations into narrative templates that can be remembered. Hunger, war, and climate stress teach the same lessons in many languages, and they often teach them with the same emotional rhythm. Convergence without contact is not a handwave, and it has specific drivers that we can name. Agricultural societies depend on seasonal reliability, and climate swings punish them quickly, especially at the margins of rainfall. States depend on legitimacy, and legitimacy fractures after defeat and famine when promises fail publicly. Writing and archives are vulnerable to fire and flood, and loss of records feels like loss of reality, not just loss of paper. When survivors rebuild, they compare their scarcity to imagined fullness, and the contrast becomes a story. The mind then organizes that comparison as a sequence of ages, because sequences are easier to teach than chaos. Metals make convergence even more plausible, because metals are universal constraints that every complex society eventually meets. Early societies learn that copper is workable, bronze is stronger, and iron is harder, and that each step changes warfare and farming. They also learn that iron is common, while gold is rare and socially charged, which makes it perfect for moral symbolism. A metaphor that maps moral value onto material value will emerge easily, because the mapping is intuitive. Hardness becomes endurance, and rarity becomes sacredness, even when no one plans it. The metaphor does not require a shared origin, and it does not require a single teacher. It requires shared experience of matter, and shared anxiety about what matter does to people. Still, we keep disciplined wonder, because convergence does not erase the mystery that keeps returning. Why do so many cultures insist the past was not only different, but greater, as if scale itself has shrunk? Why do they place us in a late age, living after a thinning of power, where the world feels less responsive? Why do they pair decline with a memory of lost knowledge, as if forgetting were a historical force? Those questions keep the series' hook alive without forcing an answer we cannot justify. What if the oldest written history is not the beginning, only the seventh attempt to rebuild it, with earlier attempts erased? Greek myth adds a specific warning to that hook, and it sharpens the stakes without changing the theme. Fire is a technology, and technology is a relationship, not a possession you can bury and retrieve unchanged. It depends on social continuity, ethical restraint, and stable institutions, including the quiet institutions of teaching. When those fail, the flame can shrink, even if the species survives and farms continue. A later people can inherit ruins without instructions, reading stones like a language they cannot speak. They can see the shape of greatness, yet lack the method to reproduce it, and that gap becomes myth. This is where the heroic age becomes more than an odd insertion, because it resembles the way epics preserve fragments after collapse. A society may lose bureaucracy, yet keep songs about exceptional ancestors, because songs travel light. It may forget engineering, yet remember names and battles, because names are easier than methods. Heroes become containers for lost capacity, translated into character rather than technique. Giants and demigods stand in for a past that feels physically larger, as if bodies match monuments. The metaphor says the ancestors were built differently, because their world was, and the claim expresses a real psychological distance. We can now connect Greece back to Mesopotamia's bridge from mythic to recorded time, because both are trying to stitch a tear. The king list gains traction when it overlaps with archaeology in later sections, and that overlap gives it a kind of anchor. Hesiod does not offer that kind of traction, yet he offers a comparable function for Greek society. He anchors present hardship in a structured past, and that structure governs expectations about what is normal. If you believe you live in iron, you expect struggle and injustice, and you may endure them differently. The myth becomes a social weather report, forecasting storms as if they were seasonal. Mesopotamia translates decline into numbers and a flood boundary, turning time into a ledger. India translates decline into dharma and cosmic ratios, turning morality into a measurable loss. Greece translates decline into metals, labour, and the fragile gift of fire, turning history into texture and heat. Each translation preserves the same emotional mathematics, even when the symbols differ. The farther we get from the origin, the more we work, and the less we trust, and the less the world feels enchanted. The world becomes harder, and we become smaller inside it, even as our tools sharpen. Decline myths appear everywhere, and they can be explained in multiple ways, from diffusion to shared psychology. Yet one motif keeps returning with even greater reach than decline, and it arrives like a sudden sound in the night. It is the flood, the hard cut that resets the human story, washing away names and tools. Floods are real events, and they are also perfect metaphors for discontinuity, because they erase without negotiating. If a single pattern spans continents, what could have imprinted it so deeply, and why does it feel like memory? Decline myths are everywhere, but the flood motif is even more universal. Next, we follow that flood motif beyond the Near East and the Mediterranean, and we keep the same disciplined rule. We test diffusion, convergence, and shared catastrophe with the same method, and we refuse to pretend myth is a spreadsheet. We treat the stories as evidence of meaning, then we ask what independent records allow, and where they resist. The fragile flame of civilization is still in our hands, and the next chapter asks who remembers the water, and who learned to fear it. The Sumerian king list gives us a hinge line that sounds like accounting, almost indifferent to human fear. The flood swept over, then kingship was lowered again. That calm sentence becomes our measuring stick, because it treats disaster as a break in administration. It also implies continuity after rupture, as if order can fall and be restored. In a close-up, the clay tablet's wedge marks catch raking light, and the camera lingers on the simplicity of the claim. The line is not a poem, and it is not a confession. It is a bureaucratic pivot that assumes the world can restart. That assumption will echo as we listen to other cultures speak in different accents. We begin with the Levant, where Genesis frames a flood as moral crisis and cosmic reset. Noah is warned in advance, given instructions, and told to build a vessel with precise dimensions. Survival is selective, and renewal becomes a covenant that reorganizes human time. The story is structured like a legal drama where judgment and mercy share the same stage. Visually, we move from desert hills to darkening skies, then to a wooden hull rising against a widening horizon. Rain becomes a curtain, and the sound design makes water feel heavy, not picturesque. The narrative insists that human violence has contaminated the world and that cleansing requires a boundary. When the waters retreat, the rainbow is not decoration. It is a sign of terms, an agreement about the future. The similarities to Mesopotamia are immediate, but the differences matter if we are being disciplined. In Atrahasis, the gods are managing population and noise, not punishing universal evil. The flood is an administrative solution, and the divine realm regrets the side effects when offerings stop. In Genesis, the flood is judgment, and the post-flood world is bound by law. Those contrasts are not minor because they reveal what each society thought order required. One tradition imagines the divine as a council balancing competing needs. The other frames the divine as a moral sovereign who sets constraints on human behavior. In both cases, catastrophe becomes a tool for resorting the world. We move east to South Asia, where the Manu story carries a different accent and a different cosmological scale. A fish warns Manu of an approaching deluge, and guidance arrives before the water. A boat is prepared, life is preserved, and a new order begins after the retreat. The warning is intimate, almost domestic, even as it gestures toward vast cycles. The camera follows a river that looks calm until monsoon clouds stack like stone above the horizon. Then we cut to a small figure at the water's edge, receiving instruction from a creature that should not speak. The fish grows, and the myth signals transformation, small signs becoming large realities. The boat is not merely a vehicle, it is a portable world, a container for continuity. Manu's flood is not only punishment, and it is not only geology, it is also cosmology, set inside cycles that already expect endings and restarts. The story teaches preparedness, obedience to instruction, and continuity through a narrow passage. In plain language, it says that survival depends on listening before the crisis becomes obvious. That cyclical framing changes the emotional temperature of the flood. If the universe has seasons of creation and dissolution, then catastrophe is not a unique scandal. It is a phase, and the moral question becomes how one carries duty through it. The flood becomes a test of alignment with order, not simply a verdict on wrongdoing. We move west again to Greece, where Deucalion and Pyrrha survive a flood that clears the stage for a new beginning. The cause is divine anger, but the moral framing is less legalistic than Genesis. Renewal arrives through an origin act, repopulating the world from stones and endurance. The myth feels like a meditation on resilience, not a legal code. A small craft bumps against rock, and the world looks emptied of familiar voices. Then comes the strange instruction to cast stones behind them, and the stones become people. It is an image of culture rebuilt from the hard materials that remain. Across these famous narratives, a comparative pattern emerges, and it is more than coincidence in plot. There is warning, there is a vessel or refuge, there is a remnant, and there is renewal. Yet the cause, scale, and moral logic shift with each culture's worldview. The same skeleton wears different meanings. Flood traditions appear across indigenous cultures with no clear line of borrowing, and that matters for our method. The question becomes why this motif is so persistent, and what it can realistically encode. Are we hearing one ancient event, or a recurring human negotiation with water? In the Americas, many communities preserve flood memories in distinct local forms, often anchored to named places. Some stories describe rising waters that remake coastlines and river valleys. Some describe canoes, mountaintops, or animals that help survivors endure. The details vary, but the emotional logic is recognizable. We see rivers that widen into inland seas during spring melt, and we see coastal inlets where storms can climb suddenly. In these settings, a flood is not abstract theology. It is a remembered boundary between before and after. In Mesoamerica, flood episodes appear inside broader cycles of world ages, nested within a larger architecture of time. Destruction and renewal can be framed as periodic, not singular. The flood becomes one reset among others, paired with creation and recreation. In that structure, catastrophe is part of the calendar of existence. This matters because cyclical time changes what a flood means. If worlds can end more than once, then the story becomes a lesson about transitions. It trains attention on thresholds, on the moment when stability fails. It also suggests that renewal is not automatic, it must be enacted. In North America, flood stories often attach to specific places and hazards, like a bend in a river or a low pass. They can explain why a valley looks the way it does, or why a mountain is sacred. They can encode social rules about respect, reciprocity, and restraint. Geography becomes ethics, and ethics becomes survival. In South America, flood motifs can connect to river systems that dominate life and shape settlement patterns. The Amazon basin teaches that water is both highway and threat, sometimes in the same week. A story that centers water is not abstract theology, but lived risk management. It speaks to navigation, storage, and the timing of movement. Visually, we follow a canoe through flooded forest, where trunks rise like pillars from brown water. The boundary between land and river dissolves, and the world becomes a single reflective surface. In such a landscape, a great flood can be seasonal and still feel total. The myth captures that totality of experience. We cross the Pacific into Oceania, where sea and storm define the boundary of survival for island societies. Islands remember waves, cyclones, and sudden inundations that erase settlements in a single night. Here, the flood is often the ocean itself, not a distant river. The sea is both provider and judge. In parts of East Asia, flood stories center on rivers that demand engineering and collective coordination. China's traditions include the problem of taming waters, not merely escaping them. The flood becomes a test of governance, labor coordination, and legitimacy. The moral is political as much as spiritual. We see wide rivers carrying sediment like liquid earth, and we see levees stretching across flat plains. The Yellow River in particular is famous for shifting course, because its bed can rise above the surrounding land. When such a river breaks through, it behaves like a moving wall. The story of taming water becomes a story of state capacity. In Africa, flood narratives appear alongside drought narratives, because both are existential and often interlinked. River floods can fertilize, but they can also destroy, depending on timing and scale. Stories can preserve the lesson that nature's gifts arrive with conditions. A blessing can become a hazard when it arrives at the wrong moment. Across regions, we keep seeing the same narrative components, but recombined like motifs in music. A warning arrives through a deity, an ancestor, or an animal messenger, and that messenger is rarely random. Survival comes through a boat, a raft, a tree, a mountain, or a protected enclosure. The means differ, but the logic is consistent. The remnant is rarely random, and that is a key similarity that deserves emphasis. Survivors are often chosen for virtue, obedience, or usefulness to renewal, and the selection is part of the lesson. Flood stories therefore function as moral instruction, even when they begin as hazard memory. They teach who is trusted to carry the future. But the differences are equally instructive, and they prevent lazy conclusions that flatten cultures into one template. Some floods are local, tied to one river or coastline, and the story names the exact ridge that stayed dry. Some are framed as world-ending, because the known world is the only world that matters. The myth speaks in the scale of lived networks. Scale in myth is often a map of perception, not a measurement of water volume. If a community's entire network lies in one valley, a valley flood is total. The language of totality can be accurate to experience, even if not global. The story's world is the world that fed you. This is where hydrology meets human settlement, and the connection is not mysterious once we look closely. Early civilizations cluster near rivers, deltas, and coasts because water creates surplus and predictable routes. The same geography that feeds cities also concentrates flood risk. Prosperity and vulnerability are built from the same terrain. Floodplains offer fertile silt, predictable transport, and easy irrigation, and those are not small advantages. They also offer avulsions, levee failures, storm surges, and compound disasters that stack hazards together. A society that lives by water must also remember water's violence. Memory becomes infrastructure when infrastructure fails. The Mesopotamian alluvial plain makes this logic visible at high resolution because the landscape is so flat, perched rivers can jump channels, and canals can cascade failure across fields. One breach can turn an administrative triumph into a regional catastrophe. In such a system, control is always provisional. We can visualize it with simple diagrams because the mechanics are concrete. Sediment raises a riverbed, embankments confine flow, and pressure builds during peak discharge. When the barrier breaks, water seeks the lowest path, often carving a new course. The result is not only flooding, but the sudden reorganization of a whole economy. The same logic applies to the Indus, the Ganges, the Yellow River, and the Yangtze, each with its own rhythm. Rivers build civilization by building soil, then threaten it by moving that soil. The hazard is not an exception, but part of the bargain. Stability is negotiated season by season. Coasts add another layer of vulnerability, especially after the Ice Age, when the planet's shorelines were in motion. Sea level rose dramatically as glaciers melted, and coastlines migrated inland. Communities that once lived on coastal plains could be displaced within generations. The sea's advance can feel like an enemy that never retreats. Post-Ice Age transitions were not smooth, and the climate record shows abrupt shifts that compress change into human lifetimes. Meltwater pulses, changing monsoon patterns, and altered storm tracks could intensify flooding in vulnerable basins. A rapid change can feel like the world breaking its contract. The old seasonal rules stop working. For a coastal community, inundation can be permanent, not seasonal, and that permanence is psychologically decisive. Land disappears, fresh water becomes brackish, and graves vanish under tides. A story that says the sea swallowed the world can be literal at local scale. The loss is not a metaphor when your shoreline is gone. This is one plausible engine for flood persistence without requiring a single global deluge. Many floods, in many places, across many centuries, can converge into one archetype. The archetype then travels easily because it matches real fear. It also matches real decision points about when to leave. We also have to consider tsunamis, which create sudden, unforgettable boundaries between ordinary life and silence. A tsunami does not need a river, and it can erase a coastline in minutes. Survivors can carry that memory inland, where the ocean's reach seems supernatural. The wave becomes a messenger from a realm beyond maps. Earthquakes can trigger landslides that dam rivers, then release catastrophic outburst floods that arrive like a second disaster. Volcanic eruptions can change rainfall patterns and destabilize slopes, priming watersheds for failure. Catastrophe chains produce floods that feel intentional because they arrive as sequences. The mind searches for agency when events stack. So why do stories keep the warning and the vessel, even when the triggering events differ? Because those elements teach actionable behavior under uncertainty, and action is what stories can transmit. They encode that listening, preparing, and moving quickly can separate survival from loss. They also preserve the idea that foresight is a kind of virtue. This is where oral tradition becomes data, if we treat it carefully and with respect for its purpose. Stories can preserve geography, like which ridge stays dry and which valley becomes a trap. They can preserve hazard timing, like when storms arrive and how rivers behave. They can even preserve sensory cues, unusual animal behavior, strange tides, or shaking ground. Oral traditions can also preserve social lessons that are hard to legislate, because they must be felt to be followed. They can teach cooperation during evacuation, and restraint during rebuilding when resources are scarce. They can warn against arrogance, exploitation, and ignoring elders who remember previous waters. In that way, narrative becomes a tool of social coordination. Yet oral tradition is not a tape recorder, and the documentary draws a boundary that protects both science and story. Stories change with retelling, and symbols expand to fit new crises. A flood can absorb later floods, and a local event can become cosmic theatre. The transformation is not corruption, but adaptation. Over-literal reading is therefore a risk, especially when we want the story to be evidence rather than guidance. If we force every flood myth into one global timeline, we erase local histories and distinct meanings. We also miss the real intelligence inside adaptive storytelling. The point is not only what happened, but what to do when it happens again. Disciplined wonder means holding two truths at once, without collapsing either into the other. Flood stories can be rooted in real environmental shocks, and also shaped by moral and political needs. They can be memory, metaphor, and governance, all at the same time. The challenge is to ask what each layer is doing. This returns us to the series hook, now with higher stakes and sharper imagery. What if the oldest written history is not the beginning of civilization, only the seventh attempt to rebuild it? Flood narratives worldwide make that possibility feel emotionally plausible. They make rebuilding feel like an ancient habit. But plausibility is not proof, and Chapter 7 refuses to skip the hard step that separates wonder from claim. If floods and decline are common, then many societies will imagine earlier greatness, because loss invites reconstruction. The sharper question is whether material traces support anything beyond expected prehistory. Do we find evidence that forces us to revise the baseline? We ask it carefully, because the claim is extraordinary and the ground is stubborn. Do we see anomalous engineering, unexpected settlement complexity, or lost coastal sites now underwater? Do we see discontinuities that look like knowledge collapse, not just population movement? Do we see patterns that cannot be explained by ordinary cultural change? Underwater archaeology becomes part of the conversation, because sea level rise hides evidence in plain sight. Paleo shorelines, drowned river valleys, and submerged plains could hold settlements now beyond casual reach. Absence on land is not always absence in history. The archive may simply be underwater. We also consider that advanced does not have to mean modern or industrial, because that assumption can mislead. It can mean organized, specialized, and networked, beyond what we assume for a given era. A society can be sophisticated, then vanish, leaving only scattered signatures. Complexity can disappear faster than we expect when systems are brittle. Still, we keep the rule from earlier chapters, and we say it out loud to keep ourselves honest. We do not turn myth into a spreadsheet, and we do not turn gaps into certainty. We use stories to generate hypotheses, then ask what independent evidence permits. The method is slow, but it is how we avoid self-deception. The flood motif, seen globally, becomes a stress test for our method and our patience. Diffusion can explain some parallels, especially across connected regions with trade and shared texts. Convergence can explain others, because water hazards shape similar lessons everywhere. The hard work is distinguishing resemblance from relationship. Shared catastrophe can also exist without being one event, because the planet changed rapidly after the Ice Age. Many communities faced rising seas and unstable rivers within human memory, even if they described it differently. Many could reasonably describe their world as ending. The phrase "the world" can mean a coastline, a valley, a homeland. So the chapter's conclusion is not a single verdict, but a tightened frame that respects both story and science. Flood stories persist because humans live where water gives life and takes it. They persist because climate shifts and sea rise can erase homelands and archives. They persist because memory is a survival tool. They persist because oral tradition is a survival technology, carrying maps and ethics through disruption. They persist because catastrophe invites moral accounting, and moral accounting invites narrative. The motif is universal because the vulnerability is universal. The flood is a mirror, and the reflection is human. If flood and decline are shared human templates, the King List's hinge line may be one expression of a global grammar. If it is more than grammar, the ground should show it. If it is only grammar, the ground will stay quiet. We leave the flood stories and step onto contested ground where stones and sediments argue back. The central question tightens here, because the ground does not speak in parables. Do myths of earlier worlds point to lost high technology, or to underestimated human capability? Archaeology is not a single voice, and it is not a single kind of evidence. It is a method built from layers, dates, tools, and cautious inference, where every claim is tied to context. It explains much with ordinary processes, and it also admits uncertainty where the record is broken, drowned, or disturbed. In practice, archaeologists read landscapes the way geologists read cliffs. They look for stratigraphy, for disturbed soil, for hearth ash, for microdebris that signals repeated activity. They compare radiocarbon dates, luminescence dates, and material sequences, because one method can mislead when conditions are wrong. We begin at Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Anatolia, dated to the deep pre-agricultural past. The site sits in the early Holocene, after the last glacial world loosens its grip. It is before cities, before pottery, before metal, and before the familiar architecture of farms and villages. In the light of a rising sun, the hilltop looks quiet at first. Then the geometry emerges, circular and oval enclosures cut into the earth, with tall T-shaped pillars standing like a ring of pale silhouettes. Even in photographs, the limestone has a chalky brightness that makes the carvings read like shadows. The pillars carry carved animals and abstract symbols that imply shared meaning across a community. Foxes, boars, snakes, birds, and insects move across the stone in low relief, as if the surface is a skin. Some figures look alert and tense, and that tension suggests stories, taboos, or protective power. Their scale implies planning, labour coordination, and repeated gatherings that return to the same place. Many pillars weigh multiple tons, and their placement is not casual. The architecture implies ritual centrality before farming becomes dominant, which is a reversal that still feels counterintuitive. For decades, a common story placed monument building after agriculture and surplus. The logic was simple. Farming creates stored food supports specialists, and specialists build monuments. Göbekli Tepe reverses that expectation, because it looks like a monumental project built by people we would otherwise label as foragers. It suggests that belief, feasting, and social obligation can organize labor before fields and herds stabilize. A ritual calendar can pull scattered groups together, and those gatherings can create alliances and marriages. In that sense, monumentality can be a social technology, one that makes larger communities possible. Mainstream archaeology does not treat this as impossible, and it does not require a secret missing civilization. It treats it as a revision of sequence and causality, where the order of steps changes. Complex social organization can precede agriculture, and ritual centers can help create the conditions that later make agriculture advantageous. The deeper implication is not that hunter-gatherers were secretly modern. It is that the category is too simple, and it hides variation that matters. Foragers can be sedentary in seasons, they can store food, and they can manage landscapes with fire and selective harvesting. They can also maintain far-reaching social ties that move information faster than we expect. A stone tool style can spread across regions without a state, and a symbolic motif can travel with marriages and seasonal meetings. When we see shared imagery at Göbekli Tepe, we are seeing a network, not a lone camp. Göbekli Tepe also raises a practical question that keeps returning in this series. How do people without metal tools quarry, shape, and move multi-ton stones? The answer is not one trick, and it is not a miracle. It is many small methods stacked into a working system where each step is plausible on its own. Stone hammers, antler picks, abrasion, wedges, and patient time can do more than modern intuition expects. Limestone is workable with hard stone, especially when you exploit natural bedding planes. A groove can be pecked deeper day after day, and a crack can be persuaded to run where you want. Organization is a technology, and it is often the missing piece in modern imagination. Scheduling labor, feeding workers, and maintaining motivation are part of the engineering, because fatigue and morale are physical constraints. When people return to a site repeatedly, they also bring learning, and learning multiplies efficiency. Experimental archaeology tests these claims by building, dragging, and lifting with plausible tools. Teams measure friction, rope wear, and the way sledges behave on wet clay or timber tracks. It rarely produces a single definitive solution, but it shows ranges of feasibility and exposes where our assumptions are lazy. A key lesson is that precision does not require machines, but it does require standards. Repeated measurement can be done with cords, plumb lines, sighting, and templates, and the human eye is good at detecting symmetry. Skilled hands can achieve tight fits when the work is iterative and supervised, because errors are corrected before they multiply. Still, Göbekli Tepe remains a shock to linear narratives, even after we explain the mechanics. It is early monumentality with a complex symbolic program, and it is not a one-off boulder with a story attached. It forces a question we cannot avoid. If complexity can appear early, what else might we be misplacing in time? From Anatolia we widen to megalithic engineering more broadly, because the pattern is global. Massive stones appear in many regions, separated by oceans and millennia. They appear with different purposes, from burial to ritual to territorial signalling, and yet the physical problems rhyme. The engineering questions are similar even when the cultures are not. Where did the stones come from, and how far were they moved? How were they extracted without shattering, and how were they transported over uneven ground? How were they raised and set with control, without cranes or steel? Mainstream explanations emphasize leverage, friction management, and incremental movement, because physics does not change with mythology. Rollers, sledges, lubricated tracks, and earthen ramps are not glamorous, but they are effective. When labour is abundant and time is long, a simple machine becomes a powerful one. Transport is often framed as the hardest step, yet quarrying can be equally demanding. Detaching a block from bedrock requires planning fracture lines and managing breakage, because a single uncontrolled crack wastes months. The work is slow, but slowness is not the same as impossibility, especially when a community treats the project as sacred duty. In some settings, the landscape itself becomes part of the machine. A gentle slope can be turned into a ramp, and a river can become a conveyor if seasons are understood. Winter ice, wet sand, and compacted soil change friction dramatically. Small environmental choices can decide whether a haul succeeds. Precision is another magnet for extraordinary claims, especially when joints look tight or alignments look intentional. We have to separate two questions because they are not the same. Can ancient people do this, and did they do it in this specific case? Some sites show impressive stone fitting and surface finish, where seams seem to disappear in shadow. The temptation is to leap from skill to lost machines, because modern viewers associate precision with power tools. The disciplined move is to test the simplest adequate explanation first, then see what remains unexplained. Experimental results show that hard stone can be shaped with softer stone and sand over time. Abrasives do the cutting, and the tool mainly holds grit in place, which is a plain language way to say that patience can substitute for horsepower. Copper tools can be used with abrasives to work harder materials, and repeated strokes leave surprisingly regular surfaces. Specialization matters here, because skill is a resource. A person who shapes stone every day learns angles, pressure, and the sound of a developing crack. Over years, a community can produce craftsmen whose hands are effectively calibrated instruments, even if their toolkits look simple. Yet the record also includes genuine puzzles, and it is honest to name them. Some stones are moved from distant sources with no obvious route, and some cuts and finishes are hard to replicate quickly with known tools. These puzzles are invitations to research, not shortcuts to certainty, and they should sharpen methods rather than inflate conclusions. Awe is appropriate here, but it should be directed at humans, not at fantasies. Ancient builders were not naive, and they were not merely following instinct. They were often operating at the edge of what their systems could support, balancing food, weather, politics, and belief in a single risky project. Advanced is not the same as complex, and the difference matters for how we read anomalies. A society can be complex in ritual and organization, without being advanced in metallurgy or writing. Advanced often implies specific technologies like metalworking, wheeled transport, high-temperature kilns, or standardized writing. It also implies infrastructures that scale, like roads, ports, and bureaucratic storage. Complex can mean dense social networks, specialized roles, long-distance exchange, and sophisticated symbolic systems, even when tools remain stone. Göbekli Tepe looks complex in ritual architecture and coordination, and that is already a major revision. It does not show cities, bureaucracy, or texts, and it does not show industrial residues. That matters for how we connect it to claims of earlier global civilizations, because global systems leave broad, repeated fingerprints. The Sumerian king list speaks in the language of kingship and cities, and it carries the tone of administration. It is a document of legitimacy and urban order, not a campfire tale, and that tone can be persuasive. If there were truly 6 advanced civilizations before ours, we would expect durable signatures of those capacities across multiple regions. Durable signatures include widespread metallurgy with slag and furnaces, because smelting leaves stubborn waste. They include standardized writing or accounting marks, because administration repeats itself in durable media. They include dense urban layers, roads, and large-scale water management, and they include trade networks visible in sourced materials. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but it is still information that must be weighed. Some technologies preserve well, and they preserve in bulk. Smelting debris in ceramics can survive when wood and textiles vanish, so a high-tech system must leave something difficult to erase. This is where anomalies can mislead us if we treat them as isolated marvels. A single monument can be built without a state, and a single precision cut can be achieved without an industrial base. A civilization claim requires a whole ecology of evidence: tools, waste, settlements, and distribution patterns that repeat. We shift now to the coastlines, because the archive of early human life is not only on land. Sea levels rose dramatically after the last ice age, driven by melting ice sheets and thermal expansion. Shorelines moved inland, and coastal plains became seabeds, taking camps, middens and harbours with them. Rivers meet oceans, nutrients bloom, and migration routes converge. Fish, shellfish, wetlands, and trade corridors create abundance. So many early settlements likely sat on land that is now underwater. Underwater archaeology is therefore not a niche, and it is not a romantic side quest. It is a missing chapter of human prehistory, written in drowned valleys and submerged terraces. It is also technically difficult, expensive, and slow, which means the map of known sites is still thin and uneven. We can say some things confidently, because the science of sea level change is well constrained. Paleo shorelines can be reconstructed from bathymetry, sediment cores, and dated coral terraces. Drowned river valleys can be traced like ghost highways, and submerged caves can preserve evidence of human presence in protected chambers. We can also say what remains speculative, and we should say it clearly. Claims of vast submerged cities often circulate faster than verified excavation, because images travel faster than context. Sonar shapes can be natural, stone alignments can be geological, and storms can rearrange seabed blocks into suggestive patterns. Disciplined wonder means we do not dismiss underwater possibilities, because the logic of settlement favours coasts. It also means we do not treat every anomaly as Atlantis, because the ocean is a powerful eraser. It is also a selective preserver, and both effects can fool us when we want a story. When a site is claimed, we ask the same questions we ask on land, and we do not lower the bar. Is there stratigraphy, and can it be read without being disturbed by currents? Are there artifacts in situ, not scattered by trawling or storms? Are there dates from multiple methods? And is there a cultural layer, not just a shape? Sea level rise also reframes the flood motif from earlier chapters, without turning it into a single global event. Many communities experience permanent inundation of homelands, and the loss would have been visible within a lifetime. A story of the sea swallowing the world can be literal at local scale, even if not planetary. This connects back to the King List hinge line without forcing it into geology. Flood can be a real hazard, a compressed memory of many events, and a political boundary and narrative. The ground can support parts of that, and the sea can hide parts of it, without validating every detail as a chronicle. Now we return to monumentality with a sharper lens, because the implications are structural. If early complexity is real, then the timeline of social organisation is more flexible than older textbooks taught. Flexibility does not automatically imply lost advanced civilizations, and it does not require an erased golden age. It implies that humans can build large projects under many economic modes, not only under agriculture. Feasting can mobilize labour, because food is both fuel and reward. Ritual can coordinate groups, and seasonal aggregation can create bursts of construction without permanent cities. It also implies that collapse and forgetting can happen at smaller scales than empires. If a ritual centre is abandoned, its meaning can vanish within generations, even if the stones remain. If a coastline is drowned, its settlements can disappear from the visible record, leaving only inland echoes. This is where the Prometheus theme from earlier chapters returns as mechanism, not metaphor. Knowledge is a chain of practice, and it is more fragile than it looks. It depends on training, repetition, and institutions that protect specialists from subsistence pressure, even when those institutions are informal. When climate shifts, trade routes fail, or conflict scatters communities, the chain breaks. Skills can be lost even if the species survives, because the teachers are gone or the apprentices are hungry. A later group can inherit stones without inheriting the method, and then the method becomes legend. The question then becomes sharper and more uncomfortable, because it points at our own assumptions. What does it take for complexity to vanish so completely that later people call it divine, giant, or impossible? What does it take for the ground to keep only fragments, broken pillars, scattered flakes, and a few stubborn dates? Mainstream archaeology offers several pathways, and none require a hidden global command. Population decline reduces labour pools and specialisation, and mobility increases when resources become patchy. Networks fragment and rare materials disappear, and memory becomes oral and then local as stories shrink to fit new realities. Catastrophe can accelerate these processes, but slow attrition can do it too. Drought can push people off marginal lands, and soil salinisation can undermine irrigation systems over decades. Political collapse can end maintenance of canals and roads, and then infrastructure becomes ruined faster than we expect. In this frame, anomalies are not necessarily evidence of a hidden global order. They can be evidence of local peaks of organisation that rose and fell, leaving impressive residues. They can be evidence that our categories of progress are too rigid, and that human societies explore many stable forms. Still, we do not close the door on extraordinary possibilities by decree, because skepticism is not the same as denial. We set a standard and we apply it evenly. Extraordinary claims must meet extraordinary evidence, meaning multiple independent lines that converge on the same conclusion. If someone claims lost high technology, we ask for manufacturing traces, not only finished stones. We ask for tool marks that demand specific materials, and we ask for residues that show repeated production. We ask for distribution patterns that imply industry, not artistry, because industry leaves waste everywhere. If someone claims a vanished global civilization, we ask for synchronized layers across regions, not just one dramatic site. We ask for shared technical signatures, and we ask for trade networks visible in isotopes and sourced materials. We ask for writing or standardized symbols that travel, because administration scales through repetition. If the claim is instead that ancient peoples were more capable than we assumed, the evidence threshold is different. We look for plausible methods, partial parallels, and incremental improvement across time. We look for social mechanisms that make labour possible, because coordination is often the hidden engine. Göbekli Tepe already supports that second claim strongly, and it does so without needing fantasy. It demonstrates that early humans could coordinate, symbolize, and build at scale, and then bury or abandon what they built. It does not demonstrate metallurgy, writing, or global administration, and that boundary matters. So the tension of this chapter is not whether the past was impressive, because it was. The tension is what kind of impressiveness we are seeing, and what it implies. Are we seeing lost industrial-like capability, or are we seeing deep human ingenuity under different constraints? Time-rich, tool-light, meaning-driven. We also confront a bias that distorts both sides of the debate, and it is a quiet one. Modern people underestimate time because our lives are short and our projects are rushed. 10,000 years is not a blur, it is hundreds of generations, enough for skills to develop, spread, and be refined. Modern people also underestimate motivation, because we assume labour must be coerced. Monument building is not only practical, it is social glue and cosmic negotiation, an identity made visible. People will move mountains for meaning, even without kings, because belonging can be stronger than command. At the same time, modern people overestimate how well the record preserves what once existed. Coastlines are gone, organic materials vanish, and even stone can be robbed and reused. Even on land, erosion and later building can erase entire phases, leaving only gaps that look like mysteries. This is why the argument cannot be settled by one spectacular site, no matter how cinematic it looks. It must be settled by patterns across many sites, dated securely, and interpreted with humility. The past is not obligated to match our expectations, and it rarely does. The disciplined approach is to treat the king list as a hypothesis generator, not as a map. If it encodes repeated collapses, we should see repeated discontinuities in settlement and network complexity. If it encodes political myth, we should see it serving legitimacy more than chronology, with numbers that persuade rather than measure. Anomalies in the ground do not decide between those options alone, and they do not need to. They do something subtler and more valuable. They show that the human past contains early peaks and missing chapters, and that forgetting is a real force that shapes what survives. We have asked whether the king list remembers literal worlds or a mythic grammar, shaped to teach through exaggeration. Now we ask a harsher question. How does a civilization vanish so completely that later peoples inherit only stories? Collapse is not one event, and it is rarely one cause, even when later memory insists on a single disaster. It is cascading failure across connected systems: food, water, governance, trade, security, and belief, where stress migrates from one subsystem into the next. Each subsystem can absorb stress for years, then fail suddenly when buffers are gone and improvisation becomes routine. A city can survive a bad harvest if granaries are full and routes stay open, because stored calories buy time for political decisions. It can survive political scandal if courts still function and taxes still arrive, because legitimacy can outlast a leader. It can survive a war if fields are planted and canals are maintained, because food and water are quieter than banners. It rarely survives when several failures synchronize, because synchronized shocks remove every option at once. Systems thinking changes the story from drama to mechanics, and mechanics can be measured in sediments, bones, and broken ledgers. A drought is not only less rain, it is less surplus and less legitimacy, because rationing reveals who matters. A flood is not only water, it is silted canals and ruined seed stock, which means next year fails too. A pandemic is not only death, it is missing specialists and broken trust, which turns technical problems into social ones. The kingless shrinking rains become a narrative signature in this frame, like a heartbeat speeding up before failure. Long rains imply stable succession, predictable harvests, and institutions that outlast individuals even when kings are mythologized. Short rains imply coups, contested legitimacy, and a state that cannot keep continuity, because every transition becomes a crisis. Numbers become a proxy for stability, even if they are stylized, because the pattern matters more than the arithmetic. The flood swept over, then kingship was lowered again. The phrase assumes that administration can reboot after catastrophe, yet it also admits that something was interrupted, like a signal cut mid-sentence. Chapter 9 asks what interruption really means in material terms when it hits bodies, fields, and memory. Start with food systems, because they are the first constraint on complexity and the first to punish overconfidence. Complex societies specialize, and specialization requires reliable calories, not just once, but year after year. When yields fall, elites compete for shrinking surplus, and the social contract turns brittle, because extraction becomes visible. People do not debate ideology when children are hungry, and hunger makes every rumor sound plausible. In agricultural terms, stability depends on timing as much as totals, because seeds respond to calendars, not averages. Climate variability can push a stable system into a new regime, where old schedules stop matching new weather. A small shift in rainfall timing can break planting schedules and reduce yields, even if annual rainfall looks normal. A few consecutive bad years can empty storage and force debt, because seed grain gets eaten. Debt can become revolt when it looks like permanent extraction, and when repayment is demanded in a world that no longer produces enough. Abrupt events amplify variability into shock, and shock is what breaks coordination. Volcanic winters can cool summers, shorten growing seasons, and disrupt monsoons, because aerosols reflect sunlight and alter circulation. Large eruptions can dim sunlight and alter circulation patterns for years, leaving tree rings thin and harvest late. The trigger can be distant, yet the famine is local, because granaries do not care where ash came from. Drought is the classic collapse driver, but it is rarely alone, and it rarely arrives politely. Drought invites conflict over wells, canals, and pasture, because water becomes a weapon and a bargaining chip. Conflict blocks trade and interrupts maintenance, which worsens drought impacts, because canals silt when labour disappears. The feedback loop turns stress into breakdown, and breakdown makes the next season even harsher. Floods can be equally destabilising, especially in alluvial lowlands where cities depend on managed water. Floods destroy stored grain, contaminate water, and spread disease, because latrines and wells mix under pressure. Floods also erase boundary markers and property lines, which fuels disputes when survival depends on precise claims. A flood can be a legal crisis as much as a hydrological one, because courts must decide ownership when the landscape has moved. Resource stress is not limited to water and soil, because cities also run on materials that never appear in myths. Deforestation can reduce fuel for kilns and metalworking, then slow construction and repair, because bricks and bronze require heat. Overgrazing can strip ground cover and increase erosion, then silt rivers and canals, because bare soil travels easily. A society can consume its own infrastructure inputs, then wonder why maintenance becomes impossible. Trade networks are the hidden skeleton of many peaks of complexity, and skeletons fail quietly before bodies collapse. Cities import timber, metals, stone, and luxury goods that signal legitimacy, because distant materials prove reach. When roots fail, elites lose both materials and symbols matter when authority is contested. A palace without bronze and cedar becomes a rumour of power, and rumours do not hold walls together. Network failure is often gradual, uneven, and misread in hindsight, because later historians see only endpoints. Peripheral towns can collapse first, then the core loses supplies and labour, because the periphery is where margins are thin. Merchants reroute, then taxes fall and soldiers go unpaid, because revenue is a network effect. The centre looks stable until it suddenly cannot coordinate, and coordination is what makes a state more than a city. Governance fails when it cannot solve coordination problems at scale, and scale is the real miracle of early states. Canals require collective labour and conflict resolution, not only engineering, because water allocation is always political. When courts are corrupt or captured, people stop cooperating and they begin to hoard effort. Maintenance becomes optional, then catastrophe becomes inevitable, because neglected systems fail on their own schedules. Legitimacy is not decoration. It is a functional resource like stored grain or trained labour. People accept taxes and labour when they believe the system protects them, and when protection is visible in hard times. When elites hoard during famine, legitimacy collapses faster than walls, because injustice spreads faster than hunger. The state becomes a predator, and citizens become fugitives, hiding grain and hiding loyalty. Pandemics and disease shocks exploit exactly these moments of distrust, because care requires cooperation, and cooperation requires belief. Crowded cities and trade routes move pathogens efficiently, as caravans and boats carry more than goods. Malnutrition weakens immune systems and increases mortality, which turns illness into demographic shock. Fear turns neighbours into threats, and care networks break, leaving the vulnerable to die unseen. We cannot always name ancient pathogens, but we can model their effects with demography and logistics. Losing a fraction of adults can erase specialised knowledge in one generation, because apprenticeship depends on healthy masters. Losing scribes can end record keeping, which ends predictable taxation and law, because the state forgets what it is owed. Losing engineers can end water control, which ends food security, because gravity does not negotiate. Conflict is both cause and consequence of these failures, and it often arrives as opportunism. Scarcity makes raids rational, and raids make scarcity worse, because violence targets the very stores that stabilise. Refugees move, and movement spreads instability across regions, because displaced people carry needs into already stressed zones. War also targets infrastructure because burning granaries is faster than winning battles, and destroying canals is easier than holding territory. Collapse is therefore not a clean fall, but a jagged descent, with uneven survival and uneven memory. Some districts remain productive while others empty out. Because microclimates and local leadership matter, some crafts persist in pockets, while long-distance exchange dies, because a kiln can survive without an empire. The map becomes patchwork, and later memory compresses patchwork into one catastrophe, because stories prefer single causes. This is where population bottlenecks enter the story, and bottlenecks are measurable in cemeteries and settlement counts. When survival is uncertain, birth rates fall and death rates rise, because families delay risk and disease accelerates loss. When people flee, they travel light and prioritise kin, not archives, because paper and clay are heavy. The population that rebuilds may be a small subset of the population that fell, and that subset carries only part of the old world. Bottlenecks change what can be transmitted, and transmission is the real battlefield of collapse. Oral stories travel well because they are portable and emotionally sticky, and because they can be retold around any fire. Administrative archives do not travel because they are heavy and context-dependent, and because they require a bureaucracy to interpret. A migrating community can carry a flood myth, but not a library of contracts, tax rolls, and engineering manuals. Writing is not just a technology, it is an institution, with costs that only surplus can pay. It requires training, standardized signs, and a reason to keep records because writing is slow without schools. If the state collapses, the incentive to train scribes collapses with it, because nobody funds years of study. Literacy can vanish within a few generations without schools and patronage, leaving marks that look like sudden silence. Even when writing survives, it can narrow into ritual use, because ritual has patrons even in scarcity. A priestly class can preserve formulas while practical engineering knowledge decays, because ceremonies can be memorized while systems must be maintained. Later readers can inherit sacred texts without the economic system that produced them, and the mismatch creates mystery. Knowledge becomes scripture when practice becomes impossible, and the words remain while the world that made them is gone. The fragile flame thesis returns here as mechanism, not metaphor, because skills do not live in objects. Skills are chains of apprenticeship, and chains break under hunger and migration. When children must work and elders die early, a technique can be lost even if tools remain, because the sequence of steps is not obvious. Later people can see ruins and still not know how to rebuild them, because the invisible steps died with their teachers. This is why regression can look like mystery from the outside, and why ruins invite supernatural explanations. A later society may reuse stones without understanding the original design, because scavenging is practical and geometry is expensive. It may imitate symbols without knowing their function, because symbols can be copied faster than institutions. It may preserve a name, then attach it to a different place, because names migrate with people. Archaeology confronts another problem that myths never mention, and it is a problem of sampling. The record is biased toward what preserves, where people later build and where researchers can dig, because excavation follows modern access. Absence in the record can be produced by erosion, sediment, and later disturbance, which means silence can be accidental. The archive is not neutral, and it never was, because nature edits and humans recycle. We call this the archaeology of absence, and it is a discipline of humility, built on what does not survive. Organic materials vanish, wood rots, textiles dissolve, and paper burns, leaving only shadows in soil chemistry. Even metal corrodes and is recycled, leaving little behind because scavengers are efficient. A society can be real and still leave a thin signature, especially if it builds in perishable materials. Coasts are a special case because they are both attractive and vulnerable, and humans have always loved shorelines. Post-Ice Age sea level rise drowned vast coastal plains as glaciers melted and oceans climbed over millennia. Those plains likely held camps, villages, and early trade nodes, because coasts offer fish, salt, and travel. Many chapters of human settlement are now underwater, hidden under sand waves and marine mud. Underwater loss does not prove high technology, and we must say that clearly, because imagination runs ahead of evidence. It explains missing sites, not missing machines, and it explains why early density might be underestimated. It can hide ordinary complexity at scale, and that alone can distort our timelines, making beginnings look later than they were. It can also tempt us to fill gaps with fantasies, and fantasies are not a method. Erosion and river dynamics can erase inland chapters too, especially where rivers wander like living things. Alluvial plains bury cities under meters of silt, then later channels cut them away. Because rivers migrate and floodplains accumulate, a site can exist for centuries, then disappear from the surface, leaving only a subtle rise. The ground can both preserve and conceal, sealing artifacts in anaerobic layers while hiding them from sight. So we draw a careful boundary in the climax of this series, because wonder without discipline becomes belief. Lack of evidence is not evidence of advanced technology, because many technologies leave stubborn waste that spreads widely. Smelting leaves slag, ceramics leave sherds, and industry leaves distribution patterns even when texts vanish. Extraordinary claims still require converging traces, and converging traces must survive more than one kind of destruction. Yet lack of evidence is also not proof that nothing happened, because erasure is real and uneven. It can mean we have not looked in the right places, or that the right places are inaccessible, underwater, or politically closed. It can mean the peak was small, coastal, or short-lived and thus easier to miss. It can mean the collapse was so thorough that reuse and erosion did the rest, grinding cities into foundations for later towns. This tension is the emotional engine behind the King List's impossible beginning, and it is why the text still feels alive. A world can be real to memory and still be unrecoverable to excavation, because memory is selective and soil is violent, A world can be mythic and still encode true principles about fragility, because metaphors can carry mechanics. Chapter 9 refuses to resolve that tension cheaply, because cheap resolution is how myths become propaganda. Now we return to the king list's shrinking reigns with new clarity, and we read them like a stress gauge. If reigns shorten, something is accelerating succession and reducing continuity, which means institutions cannot absorb leadership change. That could be stylized theology of decline, like the Yugas and ages where time itself decays. It could also mirror real instability, famine, coups, epidemics, and fractured networks, compressed into a clean sequence. We do not need literal 28,800-year reigns to take the structure seriously, because structure is where meaning often hides. We need only accept that the list is mapping a transition from stable to unstable, from long continuity to rapid turnover. It is describing a world that stops cooperating with its institutions, and cooperation is the true engine of cities. It is describing a loss of predictability, and predictability is what makes planning worth the effort. In systems terms, predictability is the hidden currency of civilization, and it is earned slowly. Predictable seasons allow planning, and planning allows specialization, because farmers can feed artisans reliably. Predictable law allows contracts, and contracts allow long-distance exchange, because trust can be outsourced to institutions. When predictability collapses, complexity becomes too expensive to maintain, and people pay the cost by simplifying. This is why collapse can be self-reinforcing even without a single final blow. As institutions fail, people retreat to local survival strategies because distant promises stop paying out. Local survival reduces surplus, which prevents rebuilding institutions, because there is nothing to fund coordination. The system can settle into a lower complexity equilibrium that is stable, yet diminished, where life continues but ambition shrinks. Migration then becomes both solution and amplifier, and it reshapes maps faster than armies. People move toward water, pasture, and safety, following rivers, coastlines, and old roads. They bring skills, but they also bring competition for resources, because every newcomer needs land. Host communities can absorb newcomers when surplus exists, and fight them when it does not, turning movement into conflict. In that movement, stories become the main continuity technology, and continuity is what humans crave. A migrating group can preserve a warning about floods and droughts, because a warning is useful everywhere. It can preserve names of lost cities as sacred places, even when the locations blur. It can preserve a sense that the world ended once, and can end again, which makes vigilance feel holy. This is how later peoples can inherit myths instead of archives, even when the past was literate. Archives require buildings, administrators, and peace is a luxury during displacement. Myths require only voices and repetition thrives in hardship. Myths also compress time, turning decades of breakdown into one night of water or fire, because compression makes meaning portable. We have now reached the climax claim of the series, but we frame it as metaphor first, because metaphor is safer than certainty. The seventh civilization idea can describe repeated resets, not necessarily 6 hidden empires, and resets can be small or regional. It can describe how many times humans rebuild complexity after bottlenecks, when networks reconnect and surplus returns. It can describe a pattern that is true even when the numbers are not, because cycles can be real without being identical. Still, the king list does something psychologically dangerous and irresistible, and it does it with calm authority. It invites us to imagine that the past held peaks beyond our map, and that our ignorance is evidence of concealment. It invites us to treat absence as concealment and myth as testimony, because the mind hates gaps. That temptation is exactly why we keep disciplined wonder as a rule, and why we keep returning to mechanisms. Disciplined wonder means we separate 3 questions that often get fused, and we refuse to answer one with another. Did collapses happen repeatedly in human prehistory and early history, in different regions and different tempos? Did some collapses erase coastal and lowland chapters we have barely sampled, because sea level and rivers are relentless editors? Did any collapse erase an industrial-level civilization that should leave global residues, like widespread pollutants and unmistakable materials? The first question is almost certainly yes, because climate and conflict are constant, and because archaeology shows repeated contractions. The second is plausible, because sea level rise and erosion are real erasers, and because underwater archaeology is still young. The third remains unproven, because the expected signatures are stubborn, and stubborn signatures tend to survive. The honest stance holds all three in view and does not let desire decide. Now we connect the mechanism back to meaning, because this is an educational series with awe, not cynicism. The awe is not only in lost cities, it is in how thin the thread of continuity can be, even in strong states. A few bad seasons can erase a craft tradition, because apprentices become labourers and workshops close. A few assassinations can erase a dynasty's memory, because archives are political targets. A few migrations can erase a writing system, because scripts die when schools die. And yet humans rebuild, again and again, often from fragments that look too small to matter at the time. They reuse stones, revive canals, and reinvent administration, because survival rewards practical intelligence. They turn ruins into foundations and myths into maps, because meaning helps coordination. The King List's calm reboot line becomes less absurd when we understand how often rebooting is required and how often it succeeds. Our civilization is more complex than any before, and complexity increases fragility through dependence, even when it increases power. We rely on global trade, specialized knowledge, and tight coupling between systems, where delays ripple across continents. The same cascade logic still applies, and it applies faster when connections are faster. We return to the Weld-Blundell Prism, because the series began with its calm voice, and because its calmness is earned. It is a real artifact, an inscribed clay prism shaped to be turned in the hand, its faces divided into narrow columns of cuneiform. It was copied by trained scribes who learned their craft through long exercises, repeating signs until the wedge angles became muscle memory. Preserved by clay and chance, it survived because fired earth can outlast roofs, timber, and even the names of kings. Scholars can place it within a tradition of king lists, city claims, and political theology, which is a polite way of saying it is propaganda with a sacred accent. In Mesopotamia, lists were not merely records, because records were power. They were teaching texts, administrative tools, and ideological maps that told you where authority belonged. The prism is not an isolated oddity, and it is not a modern forgery, because its script, language, and formulae sit comfortably among other early second millennium copies. What scholars can say with confidence is structural, not sensational, and the structure is the message. The list frames authority as cosmic office. Kingship descends as if it were weather, not politics, then routes that office through named cities. It reads like administration, yet it serves legitimacy, because legitimacy is the first technology of states. When the text says a city became the seat of rule, it is also saying rivals did not. It compresses time into a sequence that makes rule feel inevitable, and inevitability is a kind of armour. The prism's lines move forward with a steady cadence, as if history were a conveyor belt rather than a battlefield. Names become links in a chain, and the chain becomes proof. Even the physical format supports that effect. Turn the prism, and the story continues without interruption. What remains interpretive is exactly what tempts literal belief, because the numbers look like measurements. The antediluvian rains stretch into spans that defy biology and demography, and that tension invites explanations. The numbers may be numerology, unit confusion, symbolic deep time, or mythic exaggeration, and each option carries different assumptions about how scribes thought. Some scholars note the Mesopotamian preference for sexagesimal counting, where 60s and 3600s can become rhetorical as well as practical. The chronology is not anchored by independent dates, and the reigns are not corroborated by contemporary archives, because the earliest layers are beyond our administrative paper trail. We do not have matching year names, tax tablets, or building inscriptions for those antediluvian rulers. Historicity is therefore uncertain, even if the text is authentic, and that difference matters. An authentic text can preserve myth with perfect fidelity. Now we answer the central question without breaking the rules we set. Current evidence does not demonstrate multiple advanced global civilizations before ours. We do not have converging signatures of industry, administration, and widespread technology in deep prehistory. We do not have the stubborn waste that high technology leaves behind at scale: slag heaps, synthetic residues, standardized components, or the dense logistical scars that supply chains require. Archaeology is especially good at finding repetition, because repetition creates patterns in the ground. If a society smelts metal widely, slag accumulates in predictable places, and furnaces leave heat-altered soils. If it makes ceramics at scale, sherds become a background noise across landscapes. If it runs bureaucracies, seals, weights, and standardized marks multiply, and they appear in more than one valley. Yet the record also does not support a simple story of steady ascent, because stability is not the default state of complex systems. Archaeology shows repeated regional collapses, contractions, and reorganizations across millennia, sometimes with abrupt abandonment and sometimes with slow thinning. Earth science shows that coasts drowned, rivers migrated, and climates shifted abruptly enough to break systems. Comparative mythology shows that flood and decline motifs recur with unusual insistence, as if many cultures kept arriving at the same nightmare. Even when there is no single global catastrophe, there are many regional ones, and they can be synchronized by climate. A shift in monsoon patterns can reduce harvests across wide areas, while a cooling event can shorten growing seasons in multiple latitudes. In the sediment record, you can sometimes see the signature of stress, dust layers, flood deposits, or changes in pollen that hint at vegetation collapse. These are not stories, but they rhyme with stories. So the seventh civilization becomes a lens, not a headline, and a lens can sharpen without inventing. It can be literal in small ways, where one region rebuilds after another resets, and where a new polity inherits fields, canals, and warnings. It can be symbolic in large ways, where memory compresses many failures into one floodline. Either reading keeps the warning intact because the mechanism is real, and mechanisms do not require miracles. We leave the temptation of hidden empires and return to patterns we can defend, because defensible patterns are already dramatic. Resets do not require a single worldwide catastrophe, because human settlement is concentrated in vulnerable places. River valleys, deltas, and coasts are productive, and they are also easy to erase. A local inundation can feel like the whole world when your whole world is a floodplain. Picture the aerial view: braided rivers, low fields, and a thin strip of dry ground where houses cluster. One storm surge, one levee failure, one upstream landslide, and the map redraws itself overnight. The soil that fed you becomes a slurry that buries your storage pits. The same water that carried trade boats becomes a moving wall. The same story repeats because the same vulnerabilities repeat, and because humans keep choosing the same advantages. Water is both lifeline and weapon, and it fails in both directions. Too much water destroys stores, seed, and sanitation, then disease follows, because pathogens thrive when clean boundaries collapse. Too little water breaks calendars, then debt and conflict follow, then institutions fracture, because scarcity turns cooperation into accounting. Climate shifts amplify that fragility by changing timing, not only totals, and timing is what agriculture lives on. A few altered seasons can empty buffers and expose inequality, because the poor experience variability first. Trade networks then fail quietly, because routes depend on predictable security and surplus is what pays for guards and ships. When networks fail, specialization collapses, and knowledge becomes too expensive to keep because specialists must eat even when their craft cannot. This is why myths encode floods, ages, and declining lifespans, and why those motifs feel like more than entertainment. They are not only stories about gods, they are models of diminishing predictability, translated into characters and epochs. The king list's shrinking reigns rhyme with the Yugas and the ages of man, even if the traditions never met. Each tradition turns systemic stress into a moral and temporal descent, as if ethics and climate were braided. We also learned why the evidence feels split between stone and silence, and why that split can mislead us. Monumentality can appear early, because organization is a technology, and belief can mobilize labor without machines. A temple is not only architecture, it is coordination, food provisioning, scheduling, and shared purpose. Göbekli Tepe shows complexity without cities, writing, or metallurgy, and its carved pillars stand like frozen choreography. In the mind's eye, the site is lit by low sun, and shadows stretch across limestone rings. Animals emerge from the stone: boars, foxes, serpents, rendered with a precision that implies practiced hands. The builders did not need bronze tools to create meaning at scale. It expands what humans could do without proving an industrial world. We also learned why absence is not empty, because landscapes are not neutral archives. Sea level rise drowned coastlines where early density likely clustered, and the continental shelves became quiet museums underwater. Rivers buried and cut sites, and later peoples recycled stone and metal, because reuse is efficient and scarcity is constant. The archive is edited by water, erosion, and reuse, which means some chapters are missing by physics. But disciplined wonder requires a boundary that stays firm, because wonder without boundaries becomes a license. Missing chapters can hide settlements, not necessarily machines, and the difference is measurable. High technology scales through repetition, and repetition leaves repeated traces, even when cities fall. Smelting leaves slag, ceramics leave sherds, and administration leaves standardized marks, and those marks tend to spread beyond one sacred center. We hold two conclusions together, because both are supported, and because mature thinking can tolerate tension. Multiple advanced prehistories are not demonstrated by current evidence, and that is not an insult to imagination. Repeated resets and cultural amnesia are strongly supported by collapse patterns, drowned landscapes, and the universality of catastrophe memory. The Prism does not prove Atlantis, yet it does not let us relax, because it shows how confidently a culture can narrate its own deep past. Now we ask why the Prism still feels like a message addressed to us, even across 4,000 years of dust. It is small, durable, and written in a code that required schools, teachers, and standardized sign lists. It outlasted palaces, canals, and armies, because clay can survive where paper burns and where bronze is melted down. It is a reminder that survival of information is not proportional to importance, and that survival often favors the humble medium. The real takeaway is not that advanced once existed everywhere, then vanished, leaving only riddles. The takeaway is that advance is not permanent, and permanence is engineered, not assumed. Resilience is a technology, and it can be designed like any other system, with testing and failure in mind. It depends on redundancy, stewardship, and the humility to plan for failure before failure arrives. Archives are part of that technology, but only if they remain legible, and legibility is a social choice. A hard drive without power is a sealed tomb, and a file format can die faster than a language. Our records are vast, yet they are also brittle, because they depend on continuous infrastructure: electricity, cooling, networks, and the institutions that maintain them. The Prism warns that continuity is the rarest resource, and that continuity is what turns memory into history. So we translate the seventh attempt into a practical question. If our systems broke, what knowledge would travel with refugees, and what knowledge would be too heavy to carry? What would remain readable without electricity, servers, or supply chains, and what would dissolve into corrupted silence? What would a future rebuilder learn from our ruins, and what would be misread as myth? Because context is the first casualty. Imagine a future excavator holding a fragment of plastic, a circuit board, or a scorched book cover. Which objects would explain themselves, and which would look like ritual debris? Would our timestamps and metadata survive, or would they vanish like ink in rain? Would our own king list be spreadsheets that no one can open? We do not end by declaring 6 lost super civilizations as fact, because the evidence does not ask us to do that. We end by admitting what the evidence can and cannot support, then taking the warning seriously. Civilization is not a straight line. It is a fragile flame passed through floods, winters, and forgetting. The ore is not only in what might be lost, but in what we can choose to preserve, while we still have the tools.